With rigid bodies, you can bring real-life physics motion into Blender. The rigid body settings let objects fall, collide, bounce, slide, roll, break, and react to each other, not by manually keyframing every single movement, but by letting Blender simulate the physics for you. And this is one of the most powerful things inside Blender, because the moment you understand rigid bodies and how they work, you can create animations that feel heavy, natural, chaotic, and cinematic with just a few settings. So in this free masterclass, we are going to learn rigid body simulations from the basics. First, we'll cover what rigid body simulation is, how active and passive objects work, how to set up collisions, how to animate with physics, and how to bake the simulations properly. Then we'll move into more advanced controls like collision shapes, friction, bounciness, understanding sensitivity. Then finally we'll understand about the cell fracture and how to create the destruction effects in Blender. This entire course is divided into just 3 chapters, and each chapter has a practical project. Chapter number 1, we create a domino animation. Chapter number 2, we create Newton's cradle. And finally, in the chapter number 3, we create a brick wall destruction simulation. Also, if you want to follow along properly, you can download all the project files of this course from jb3dstudio.com. You can also find the project files for all my other Blender courses there, so check out the link in the description if you want the scene files, assets, and the course resources. Before starting, a special thanks to Meshi AI for sponsoring this course. Meshi AI is an AI-powered 3D creation tool that helps you generate 3D assets from text prompts, images, and it has several other exciting features for 3D artists. But more on that later, and for now, let us start with the chapter number 1. Welcome to the first chapter, Basics of Rigid Body Simulation. In this chapter, we are going to build the foundation first. We will understand what rigid body simulation actually is, why it is useful, how Blender calculates solid object motion, and then we'll move into the 2 main rigid body types, active and passive. After that, we'll take a look at animation, baking, cache settings, and finally, we will use everything to create our first project, this domino animation scene. So first, what is rigid body simulation? So rigid body simulation is a physics system used to simulate the motion of solid objects. Now the important word here is solid. In a rigid body simulation, Blender calculates how objects move, rotate, fall, collide, bounce, and react to forces. But the object itself does not bend, squash, stretch, or deform. So for example, if we drop this cube, then Blender calculates its falling motion and rotation, and if it hits another object, then Blender calculates how that impact transfers motion. But in the end, the cube still remains a cube, and that is why it is called a rigid body. Now the reason why rigid bodies are so powerful is that they allow us to create natural physical motion without manually animating every single detail. So this rigid body simulation is not just a technical feature in Blender, it is simply a way to create motion that feels natural, heavy, and of course physically believable. The first important rigid body type is active and passive. See, an active rigid body is controlled by the simulation. Like it can fall down, it can rotate, collide, and basically react with other objects. On the other hand, a passive rigid body is usually something the active objects collide with. Like it can be a floor, a wall, a ramp, or let's say a table, or any object that acts as a part of the environment. To understand it with the help of an example, in this particular domino animation scene, I have this particular domino as the active object, and as a result, when it reacts with the ball, which itself is also an active object, it will fall. But all these objects are colliding with one more object, which is this floor. And the reason why the floor is not falling downwards is that it is a passive object. So in short, the objects that will carry the actual motion, like the domino, the ball, these will be called the active rigid bodies, and the other ones with which the active rigid bodies will interact, like the floor in this case, would be the passive rigid body. Now we have understood the basics of rigid body physics, but now let's see how we can actually use it here in this scene. So I have created this new file with the default Blender layout, and I'm using the latest version of Blender right now at the time of recording, which is Blender 5.2. And to understand the rigid bodies here, I'll keep this cube selected here, and to access the rigid body physics, you simply have to go to the physics properties panel here in the properties section, and here you will find several types of physics like force field, collision physics, soft body, fluid, and one of them is the rigid body. So let's say I just select this, and we have some settings here that we'll understand as we move forward in this course. But to keep the things basic, let's go with the default settings only. And right now we cannot see any change happening in the scene because even though this is a rigid body, it will stay like this initially. But if I press the space bar to play the animation, then as you can see, it falls downwards, which is happening because of the rigid body physics. Basically, what happens here is Blender is now treating this object as a real world object, and so it's applying the physics of real world, like the gravity making it fall downwards. And this was the reason why we see it moving down in the z-axis. But let's say I take this pointer back to the frame number 1, and let's say I want this to react with other objects in the scene. Like if I just duplicate this by pressing Shift D and place it over here, then let's say I want that this cube at the bottom should remain static, like it should not move, but this one should move down and react with this bottom cube object. So the first thought that comes into my mind is that I should remove the rigid body physics from this object so that it remains static over here and does not move down, but this one will move down and I will expect this to collide with the bottom object. But there will be a problem that we'll see when I play the animation. So I'll press the space bar, and here you notice that it passes through this cube and its existence basically had no effect on this duplicate cube object. Now the question arises that how do you make them react with each other? Because if I make both of them the rigid bodies, then on pressing the space bar, both of them will move in the downward direction together. And even on making one of them as rigid body and one of them as a normal object, we were still not getting the desired results. And this is where we have to understand the concept of active versus passive rigid bodies. You can see the rigid body type is selected as active, so it will move down when we press the spacebar, like we played the animation before. And for the bottom cube, instead of active type, I'll change this to passive because I want it to remain fixed at this position, but at the same time, it should interact with the cube. So now if I press the spacebar to play the animation, then this time the two cubes, or basically the two rigid bodies, interact with each other, and this cube will not pass through this one. So this is how the active and the passive rigid body types work. To understand this with another example, I'll press A to select all and X to delete. And now let's add a plane object in the scene. This will act as the floor. So I'll scale this up to basically fall on this and roll. So I'll be adding a UV sphere by pressing Shift A and selecting the UV sphere. Let's move this up in the Z axis over here. And I think I should scale this down in the edit mode. Now currently, if I try to play the animation, then as expected, nothing will happen because none of the objects in the scene have any physics applied. So what I'll do is I'll take this pointer back to the frame number 1. And with this UV sphere selected here, I'll go to the physics properties and select the rigid body, and we'll keep the type as active because I want this to move down like this, but I want it to interact with the plane also. With this plane selected, let's go to the physics properties and give this the rigid body physics. And in the type, we'll change this to passive. This will make sure that it does not fall down and stays fixed, but at the same time also interact with the UV sphere. So now if I take the pointer back to the frame number 1 and press the space bar, then the ball falls down on the plane and stays like this. But currently the issue is it's not having much motion once it touches the plane, like it should slightly roll and change its position, which is not happening right now. And the reason, of course, is that this is a very simple setup. But let's say what I can do is I can select this plane and I can go to the edit mode and rotate this in the x-axis by a very slight angle, let's say 20 degrees, and then go back to the frame 1 and press the spacebar again. Then this time we notice something very interesting. The ball interacted with the plane and also rolls down like this, which is happening because of this angle of the plane. Previously, the plane was completely flat and it stopped the motion of the UV sphere or the ball because we have very simple settings here. But this time when we set up the plane at this angle, we see the ball rolling and falling down like this. So the main thing here was to understand the concept of active and passive type. And I hope this concept must be clear by now. And now let's move ahead to the next topic, which is animated rigid bodies. Before I explain this concept to you, let's first understand the need of this concept. So right now in the scene, we have a very simple setup where the ball simply falls down and reacts with the plane. But let's say I want this ball to be coming from this direction, where we animate it moving from here till it reaches, let's say, at this point, and then it should fall down. Basically, I'm trying to create a mix of animation by using the manual keyframes and the rigid body simulation. And for this exact same thing, we have this property here in the rigid body physics, which is animated. It's turned off by default, but we'll see what happens when we turn it on once you understand the concept of animated rigid bodies. So the rigid bodies can also work with the Blender's animation system. For example, we can manually animate an object in the beginning and then let the physics simulation take over later. This is useful when you have to push, launch, rotate, or trigger an object with keyframes instead of relying only on gravity. The key setting here is animated. When the animation is enabled, Blender follows the keyframed animation. And when it is disabled, the physics simulation takes control. This is one of the most useful tricks in the rigid body simulation because it gives us artistic control and the power of physics at the same time. To use it here in this case, I'll first go to this animated property, and by default it is turned off, meaning that it is only considering the rigid body simulation. And this also means that if I take the pointer to, let's say, frame number 1, and if I move it here in the y-axis and press I to insert a keyframe, and then let's say a few frames ahead, I'll take this in the front over here and insert another keyframe, then you will notice that it automatically takes me back to this position. Like if I undo and try this again and left click, then the same thing will happen again. Basically, it's not allowing me to change the position of this UV sphere throughout the timeline because currently it's under the influence of the rigid body simulation. But right now, if I turn it on, then you will notice that we have the changes in the y-axis location applied to this. In fact, I can go back to the frame 1 where we have this position keyframed, and then I can take the pointer to, let's say, frame 36 and move this in the y-axis, let's say over here, press I to insert another keyframe, and now if I take it back over here and press the spacebar, then this time as expected, it's only using the manual keyframes and not the rigid body simulation. If you turn it off, then even if you have the manual keyframes, it will not consider them and only fall in the downward direction because of the rigid body physics. So you have now understood what this animated property does, but let's also understand how you can use this to create some interesting animations with a mix of both the manual keyframes as well as the rigid body physics. So for this thing, what we're going to do is we'll basically animate the property of animated here. Let's say initially I want the animation where the ball moves in this direction, which we have set up using the keyframes. And then after a certain point of time, it should begin to fall downwards because of the gravity effect of the rigid body. So with this keyframe setup here, let's say I take the pointer to frame 24. Until here, I want this to be having the animated property turned on. So I'll insert the first keyframe here. And then on the very next frame, which is the frame number 25, I'll disable the animated property and insert another keyframe here. This will make sure that at the frame number 24, basically till this frame, we'll have the animation of the ball moving in this direction because of these two keyframes at the frame 1 and 36. And then after that, the animated property will turn off, meaning that the rigid body physics will begin to apply on this, causing the ball to move down. So to see what kind of combined effect it creates, let's take the pointer back to the frame number 1 and press the space bar. So this time we noticed something interesting. As expected, initially the ball moved like this, and we noticed this path of a curve. And in fact, this represents a very realistic path of how a ball would fall down when it is thrown from a particular point in space in a particular direction, and when gravity is also acting on it. To create such effects of rigid bodies, where you want the effect of both the manual keyframes as well as the rigid body physics, you simply have to animate this property of animated. In fact, if you're learning this for the first time, then I would advise you to use this with multiple examples. Like you can reverse the direction, you can change this object and try this thing with something else, or you can maybe change the keyframe animation from moving in the y axis to maybe moving up And then because of the rigid body physics, it will come down when the animated property is turned off. So you can try different combinations, especially if you're understanding this concept right now in this masterclass for the first time, because this thing is something that you would use very often whenever you have to give a particular direction to the object or the rigid body, or you have to show a throwing animation or something similar. Now, whenever you play a rigid body simulation, you must have seen this yellow or this golden color line in the timeline editor, and it basically represents the cache and baking of simulation. Before we get into it inside Blender, let's first understand the concept of cache and baking. So, when Blender plays a simulation, be it fluid simulation, rigid body simulation, or any type of physics based simulation, it calculates the physics over time and stores the result in a temporary memory. But before rendering, it is usually suggested to bake the simulation. Baking means Blender saves the calculated result, so the animation plays back consistently and does not need to be recalculated again and again. This is especially important for final renders because you would not want your simulation changing unexpectedly or behaving differently during the final render time. So the workflow is you set up the simulation, test it, adjust the settings, and once you're happy with the results, simply bake the simulation. Now in this file, you must now be knowing that the reason why we are seeing this line in the timeline editor which is highlighted, it's that on playing this animation, when we played it for 120 frames, it basically saved the simulation that we played in a temporary memory. But let's say if I go beyond this highlighted region, then you will see that we do not have the rigid body simulation saved or baked. So we are not able to see the ball rolling down. But if I take this pointer back here and press the space bar, then you can see that the baking will continue and the highlighted region will basically increase. So this is how the cache system works for the simulation. To control it in the settings, you simply have to go to the scene properties here. Then in the rigid body world, you'll have this cache option, and you can see that we have the starting and the ending frames for the simulation. By default, it is set to 1 and 250. And here you can check the number of frames that are already in the memory. Like we have 213 frames because of playing the animation. And you can also check this here in the timeline editor. We have the frame save till over here, and it keeps on updating this number depending on playing the animation in the timeline. Then you have buttons like bake, calculate to frame, bake all physics, delete. So if you have to bake the entire simulation, once you're happy with the results, you can simply click on the bake button and it will take a few seconds to bake the entire simulation depending on how complex it is. And if you want to delete the existing cache or the bake, then you can click on delete all bakes. To see it practically here, let's say I take this back to frame 1 and I'll just press G to move this and right click to cancel so that it removes the existing simulation from the memory. You can see that if I play the animation, we are back to a few frames. Like you can see, we have 5 frames only. So now if I click on the bake button, then it hardly took 1 second to bake the entire 250 frames, because in this current case, the simulation is very simple. So it took very less time. And now even if we have not played the animation completely even once, but if I try to scrub through the timeline like this, you can notice that I can smoothly play the simulation without any lags or any issues here. So this is all you need to understand about the concept of cache and baking. And now that we have understood the basics, so let's create a first project, which is a domino animation. This project is perfect for the first chapter because it uses the most important rigid body ideas in a clean and visual way. We'll create a row of dominoes, make them active rigid bodies, create a passive floor, trigger the first domino, and then let the simulation continue naturally. By the end of this project, you will understand how collisions travel through a scene and how small changes in spacing, scale, rotation, and timing can completely change the end result. But before we start building the domino simulation, let me quickly show you the trailer version of this scene. The main part of this project is rigid body setup, like the dominoes, the collisions happening, the timing, and the final bake. But for the trailer render, I wanted the scene to feel a little more complete, like with some real assets around it. So for the background props and set dressing, I used Meshy AI, who are also sponsoring this course. For the trailer version, I generated a few simple assets for the scene, like an open notebook, a small storage box, and some extra desk props for the background. The useful thing is that Meshy does not just give me plain gray models. The generated assets come with textures and materials, and even including the useful maps like roughness, normal, so that they already have the color, surface detail, and material variation to work with. Here you can take a look at the assets that I generated using Meshi for the trailer version of this scene. I simply typed the prompts, hit the generate button, apply the texture, work with the remeshing, and once the models were generated, I used the DCC bridge to send them directly to Blender. Once they are inside Blender, the assets come with their material and texture information, and so I can immediately start placing them in the scene, and it helps save me a lot of time because I didn't have to manually model and texture every prop or asset from scratch. Apart from this, Meshi also offers you a lot of new features like batch images to 3D, multicolor 3D printing, low poly optimization, enhanced hard surfaces, and a better workflow using the Nano Banana integration. So if you want to try creating 3D assets for your own Blender scenes, you can check out Meshi AI from the link in the description, and you can even get a 50% off by using that link in description and the pinned comment. Now for the Domino project, I have opened this new file and we have this default layout as usual. So press A to select all and X to delete. So for the scene that we are making, let's first begin with making the floor or the plane on which we'll have the domino pieces. So press Shift A, then go to mesh and add a plane. Then I'll go to the edit mode and I'll scale this up, let's say 10 times, or maybe I should scale it up 2 times more. And this will act as the floor on which we'll have the domino pieces. Now for the pieces, I'll be adding a cube object and then we'll adjust the scaling or the size. So select the cube, go to the front view by pressing 1 on the numpad, and let's move it up in the Z axis by 1 meters. Then go to the edit mode and let's also scale this up maybe 2 times. And then I'll again move this up in the Z axis by 1 meters. I'm doing this so that it remains exactly above the surface of the floor. Now, other than this, I think I should go to the edit mode again and scale this down in the Y axis. And you have to adjust the thickness of the domino piece, because if you make it very thick, then it will take a lot of force to basically fall down. And I'm planning to use a ball or basically a UV sphere to start or trigger the simulation. Like the ball will hit the first domino and it will interact with the others. So you have to take care of the size and the thickness of the domino piece. In this case, I'll make it very slightly thinner, something like this, so that it can fall down easily. And to give it a better look, let's press 2 for the edge selection mode and select these 4 edges over here, basically these 4 corner edges, and apply some bevel by pressing Ctrl B. Let's go to the bevel menu here and increase the number of segments to 3 or 4 depending on the angles. And let's also adjust the width. I'll very slightly increase it to 0.41 meters, or maybe I think I should go with something lower like 0.32. And for the number of segments, I think 4 will work here. So we'll go with this. Now I'll be selecting this entire edge loop by holding the Alt key and left clicking here. And similarly with the Alt and Shift key hold it. Let's select this one also. Press Ctrl B to add a very slight bevel effect here. And in the number of segments, I'll keep this to 1 or 2. Let's keep this to 2 so that we have a supporting edge, or basically a sharp edge in the center. And this is how the domino piece is looking. Let's right click to apply shade smooth, or maybe I should go for shade auto smooth. And I'm still noticing some shading issues which are arising because of the bevel that we applied here. So I think I should undo this and then apply shade auto smooth. I'll go to the modify properties, click on add modifier, then in generate, let's select bevel and decrease the amount here to maybe 0.02. And I'll keep the number of segments set to 1, because if I try to increase this value, you can see that we get some shading issues which you can solve. Like you can go to the edit mode and you can press I to insert the face, and that shading issue will go away, like you can see here. So you can choose any of the two methods. In this case, I'll be going with the insert effect only, with the number of segments set to 2 and the amount set to 0.02. Now, once you have created this basic shape of the model, you can even apply some subdivision if you want the edges to be more smooth, like especially the corner parts. If we decrease the levels viewport to 0, you can see that they look very basic and simple without any subdivisions. But if I increase this value to 2, then we get a much more smooth and polished result. So it's totally up to you if you want this or not, but just make sure that it's below the bevel modifier. because if you place this above, then you will get these issues like you can see here. So we don't want them in the result. And this is the reason why we are keeping the bevel modifier above the subdivision. One more thing that I can do here to add some more realism to this is I can go to the edit mode and just press 2 for the edge select mode and select this entire outer edge loop here, and we'll apply some bevel to it. But before that, let's also select the one on this side with the alt and the shift key hold it. We'll be selecting both of these edge loops, and then let's apply some bevel. So press Ctrl B to apply bevel and left click. Let's set the number of segments to, let's say 2, and in the width, I'll keep this to something very low like 0.03 and return back to the object mode. And this is how it looks now. Now all these changes are totally up to you if you want to make these or not. You can even go with a very simple model with just some basic bevel on the corners. Even that would work completely fine in this case. So it totally depends on you that how you want the model to appear. And now in order to make it look like this trailer version, you can see that we have to create those cutouts and one straight line in the middle. So for this, we'll be using the Boolean modifier. And first of all, let's create the cutout that we have to create in the middle. For that, I'll be adding a cube object in the scene. Let's scale it down in the z-axis and I'll type 0.1. Let's go to the front view and push it up in the z-axis. And let's also scale it up slightly like this. Let's also go to the top view to check its position, and I'll be moving it in the front here. Let's also go to the side view to check its correct position. Like I want it to be somewhere over here so that I can create a cutout like this. Now I don't want the angles to be very sharp. So with this cube selected here, let's give it some subdivision surface modifier. So I'll press Ctrl 2 to add the subdivision, and let's also add some bevel to this. Let's move the bevel modifier above subdivision and keep the number of segments to, let's say 3. Then I'll adjust the amount to somewhere over 0.07. If you want the angle to be sharp here, you can go with 0.2 or something close to it. And you can even shade this smooth. Now to create the cutout with this, I'll be selecting the domino piece, and in the modify properties, let's add the Boolean modifier. Then in the object, I'll click on this eyedropper tool and select this cube. And now if I press H to hide it, then you can see that we have this cutout created. A very important thing to note here is that you can make any type of changes in this cutout as long as you have not applied the Boolean modifier. Like you have the option to apply it from here. So just make sure that you don't apply this modifier, because then in that case it will be a permanent thing. So make sure the positions and everything else is perfectly fine. In fact, there's one more thing that you can test, which is to change the position of this Boolean modifier. Like each one will give you a different result. Usually you can either keep this above the Boolean and the subdivision surface modifier. Like this will give you this sharp result over here, or else you can keep this below both these modifiers. Just make sure that you don't keep this modifier between the bevel and subdivision, because in that case you'll get some shading and some geometry issues. So this is a small thing to keep in mind. I'll be keeping this above both the modifiers so that I can get a sharp angle over here, which I want for this domino piece. And other than this, I'll be using the same Boolean modifier method to create some circular cutouts. And for this, I think we should add some cylinders in the scene. So press Shift A, then go to Mesh and select the cylinder. Let's go to the front view, and I'll go to the edit mode to change its rotation in the x-axis by 90. And let's also scale this down. Then I'll go to the object mode and place this over here. Currently, I think that the size of the circle is too big. So let's scale this down, and you can also enable the extreme mode to see the size of the circle. Now, the thing is that you can create different variations of the domino pieces with different numbers of circular cutouts. Like some of them can have just a single cutout, some of them can have two circular cutouts, some can have three, four. Like you can create many variations with it. But in this particular case, I'll be creating just one, which will have 5 circular holes. And I'll be using the array modifier then to create a series of domino pieces. But I'll also make some changes in that so that I can randomize the flipping or basically the position of these circular cutouts. So we'll see that later. For now, I think I should go to the side view to push this forward so that we can create the circular cutout. And instead of creating the duplicate objects in the object mode, I'll stay in the edit mode only and create the duplicates here so that they will all be the part of this same cylinder object. So let's create one more cutout. Basically, I'm duplicating these by pressing Shift D. And now let's place this one over here, and one more duplicate. I'll place this one over here. Now for the bottom part, let's create one more duplicate and move this in the z-axis here. Then create one more and I'll place this over here. And for the bottom, I'll be keeping only 3 cuts like this. You can change their positions or anything else if you need. Then I'll select this domino piece and let's add one more Boolean modifier. In the object, I'll be selecting the cylinder object and let's hide it from the scene so that we can see the results. Also, I think for a better visibility, we can enable the cavity option here. This allows us to see the empty spaces in a much better way. In fact, if you need, you can even turn on the shadow option if you want an even better result. And I think that the cutouts are looking somewhat decent. We can go with these. You can even adjust the position of this Boolean modifier if you want, but I think it's causing some error. So I'll move this downwards. The error must be because of the lack of geometry, which was happening because we moved the Boolean modifier above the subdivision. So in this case, I'll advise you to keep this Boolean modifier below the bevel and subdivision. Now let's return back to the object mode and we have a basic model created for the domino piece. Now currently we only have a single domino piece in the scene, but for the animation that we want to create, we want multiple domino pieces. And for that, instead of duplicating each of these, we'll be adding the array modifier to this object. So let's go to the modifier properties and in add modifier, select generate and select array modifier. This will create the duplicates that you can see here, and by default, it will add the array modifier below the existing modifiers like subdivision, bevel, and boolean. And this is actually the correct way of adding array modifier because in Blender, the modifiers work from top to bottom. Like this is a basic concept of modifiers in Blender. So I suppose you must be knowing this already, but just in case you didn't know about this concept, so I'm telling this to you again. Whenever in Blender you have multiple modifiers, they always work from top to bottom. Like the effect of this modifier will be applied on the geometry that you have on this one. And this process continues as you move down in the modifier stack. And this will mean that this array modifier is having the effect of all the modifiers that are above it. To explain this with the help of another example, let's say I take this array modifier and bring this above this Boolean modifier. Now this Boolean modifier was carrying the data about the cylindrical cutouts, but since we have placed this below the array modifier, so it's not considering it for the duplicates or the array items, and that's why we can't see the circular cutouts here. So to ensure that all the effects are applied to all the duplicate objects, we need to place them just above the array modifier like this. And now we only have 3 of these in the scene, but in reality, we want the number to be somewhat higher, like maybe around 10. And currently they are appearing side by side as in the x-axis, but to make them appear in the y-axis, I simply have to go to the offset x value, which controls this location of these duplicates. So in the x, if I change this to 0, then all of them are basically overlapping at this default position. And if I now go to the y-axis value and try to increase it slightly, then the distance between each of them will increase like this. And basically at 0, they're all at one place. And then at a value of 1, they kind of stick to each other with negligible gap in between them because of the geometry. And as you further increase the value, they'll begin to set apart even more. So for the domino animation that we have to create, we should have a good amount of distance between each of these, because let's say a ball hits this first domino piece. So it should have some distance so that it can actually affect the next one, and then that will affect the next one and so on. So we should increase this distance. So in the offset by value, let's try a value of 2. Now we have some more distance, but I think I can increase this further to 2.5 or maybe 2.75 like this. But yes, one more thing to take care is if you increase this value to something very high, like let's say I change this to 7, then in this case, when the ball hits the first domino piece, then it will fall down and it might not really interact much with the second piece. And so we'll not be able to make the animation that we are trying to make. So just make sure you set a realistic value in the offset. In the current case, I will keep this value to somewhere between 2.5 and 3. I think I can keep this to 2.8. So this is working perfectly fine. In fact, we can even check by adding a UV sphere in the scene and applying some rigid body physics to these. We'll also be learning how to place these in a circular path. But before that, let's first test the simulation with a basic example of all of these here in a straight line. So first of all, I'll be adding a UV sphere in the scene. So press Shift A, go to Mesh and select a UV sphere. Then right click to apply Shade Auto Smooth. And I'll move this up in the Z axis and let's place this over here for now. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is to scale this up slightly. I think I should increase the scaling 3 times and push this in the Y axis over here because I'll be adding some more objects or basically some more duplicate pieces of these dominoes, and I'll place this over here. Let's go to the top view to see if everything is aligned properly or not. And now let's go to the edit mode, press 2 for the edge select mode and select this edge, and press Q to extrude this in the Z axis like this. Then I'll select this edge over here and we'll make this smooth so that the ball can roll down. Press Ctrl B to add some bevel, and in the number of segments, let's keep this to 8, and in the width, I'll keep this to 9 meters, and in the number of segments also, I'll keep this to 10. Now I'll go back to the object mode and shade auto smooth. Then I think that the size of this plane is too big, so I think I should undo this and instead should scale this down in the x-axis, then select this edge and push it downwards, and then select this edge again and press Ctrl B to apply the bevel one more time. Then select the ball, and I think we should change its scaling because currently it's too small. Like if it lands over here, then because of the size of the domino piece, it might not be able to fall in the backward direction. It might shake a little bit, but it will either fall in the forward direction because of its weight or it will remain in the same position. So to ensure that this does not happen, we should slightly scale this up so that when the ball interacts with this domino piece, it falls back and interact with other domino pieces. So I'll keep this size to something like this. And I still think that the plane size is a bit too much. So I'll go to the edit mode one more time, select this face also and press X to delete the faces. Then select this edge. Let's move it in the Y axis and extrude this one last time. Then again, I'll scale this slightly down in the X axis and let's also bring this downwards over here. Then with this edge selected, press Ctrl B to apply some bevel. And I think I should just move all these faces slightly in the Y axis like this. Now after this, I'll go to the wireframe mode and I have the side mode enabled here so that I can see the floor or basically this plane object properly. And now I'll place this over here. And in fact, to ensure that the ball properly interacts with the plane, I think I should give this some slight angle like this. I'll move this in the Y axis and this is how it will look. So we'll drop the ball from here so that it interacts with the plane and goes down like this. We can also just go to the edit mode and select this. Let's again go to the side view and push this over here so that the angle can be more smooth and it will not show any bump or something. So you can adjust the positions like this. Now after this, I think we can test the simulation now. So first of all, with this plane selected at the bottom, let's give it some rigid body physics. So in the physics properties, we have the rigid body and I'll change this to passive so that the other objects will interact with this plane. Now for the ball or the UV sphere, I'll go to the rigid body physics and in the type, we'll keep this to active because it has to fall down and interact with the other objects. But for the domino pieces, they all are currently the same object. And as a result, it will not give the results that we expect. So to show you this thing practically, I'll just add the rigid body physics for now. And let's see what kind of error do we get. And also in the shape, I'll change this to mesh, even though we could have selected the box if we were individually applying the rigid body physics to each of the domino piece. But for now, let's go for mesh for a better quality. And similarly for this also, let's change the shape to mesh. And yes, we will cover this concept of shape, source, and the other things that we have not yet covered in the first chapter. We'll do these things in the upcoming 2 chapters. So you don't need to worry about the concept here. In very simple words, it just means the shape of the object on which the rigid body physics is to be applied. If it's a complex shape, like which is very different from a box, a sphere, or any of the other options, you should go for the mesh type because it gives you better results. And for now, if I just press the space bar to see what kind of results do we get. So you can see that we get a very different type of result here. Basically what's happening is that the origin point of this entire object is lying at this point, and so it's not considering the physics properly. Like if you have multiple dominoes, then they will interact individually with each other, But because of using a single cube object with all these modifiers, and most importantly, the array modifier, which is not yet applied, due to which we are not able to separate these into separate objects, we are getting this kind of error. So to fix this thing, the solution is very simple. We just have to go back to the frame 1 and we just have to apply all the modifiers and then convert these into separate objects. But before we do that, we also need to finalize how many domino pieces will we need, but that would depend on the final example also. So a much safer method would be to create a duplicate of these domino pieces and save them for later if we need them. So I'll press Shift D to create duplicate, then right click to cancel. And I'll also go to the physics properties and remove this because we don't want any interaction with these objects in the scene. I'll hide these for now, both from the scene as well as from the camera render. And I'll again select these, then go to the modify properties, and in the count, I'll set this to something high, let's say 30. And in the offset Y, I think I'll go for a value of 3. This will set them apart even more like this. And in the randomized value, we can try something like flipping in the x-axis. And by doing this thing, you will begin to notice that it basically flips some of the domino pieces in such a way that a few of them are having this kind of pattern and other ones are having the opposite pattern, like you can observe here. And this value of 0.523 basically tells the probability or the chances of any of these pieces for having the flipping in the x-axis. If you keep this value to 1, then all of them will be flipped. But if you keep this value to 0, then none of them will be flipped. So ideally, I would keep this value to something like 0.5 so that approximately half of them will be flipped and half of them will be having this original pattern. You can even try this y-axis value to see if you get any decent results, but the y-axis is giving us this result that I don't really want, so I'll change this back to 0. Let's also try the z-axis value, and I think this one can be useful, like it reverses the pattern in a way that the one on the top will move to the bottom and the opposite also. So I think that the X and the Z flipping will be nice for this domino example. So we'll go with this. And now we can apply all the modifiers here. So let's start with this Boolean. Let's apply this. Then let's apply the bevel. Or you can even use the shortcut, which is to press Ctrl A to apply. And at last, we'll apply the array modifier. Now, if I go to the edit mode, you can see that we have all of these separately selectable. So to separate these into different objects, simply press A to select all, then press P to open the separate menu. And in this, you have this option, which is to separate by loose parts. So if I select this, then it will separate each of the geometry into a new object. Like if I go to the object mode now and try to select each of these individually, then I'm able to do that easily. But yes, even if you try to add the rigid body simulation to each of these right now, you will still get the error because let's say with this one selected, if I try to find its origin point, then I'll get to know that it's still located over here. It's true for all others also. Like you can select any of the domino piece and its origin point will still be on the first one only. And you can easily fix this thing. Like you just have to select all these pieces. So let's select all of these and let's deselect the plane at the bottom by holding the control key and deselecting like this. Then with all of these selected, I'll go to the object menu here, then set origin to geometry, which is the second option, and this will set the origin point of each of these. I also think that I should create a new collection for all of these objects because there are too many. So I'll press M to create a new collection and let's name these domino pieces, then press enter to create. And now they're all in this new collection, which is separate from the main collection. Now, just to ensure we do have the rigid body physics applied to each of these domino pieces. So I think we can do the testing now. I'll select the ball and in the shape, we can set this to sphere because it looks like a spherical object. So it will work in this case. You can even keep this to mesh for now. Now, if I press the space bar to play the animation, now the kind of result that we are getting is not actually what we wanted. Like currently, almost all of these rigid bodies begin to show motion or basically they start moving as soon as we play the animation. And it's happening because if I go to the side view, then you can see that they do have some gap between the plane and basically these objects. Like it's not there in the starting, but as the animation progresses, they move up and then return back, leading to this weird animation. So in order to fix this thing, what we simply have to do is we first have to make sure that the shape which is there in this collisions menu, is set correctly. And if you remember, I told you before that we will discuss this thing again later on in the upcoming chapters. But for now, to understand the concepts in a very simple way, you can take it like for complex shapes, you can use mesh. Otherwise, try to choose the shape that the objects most resemble with. And in this particular case, the domino pieces are having the bevel effect on the top and the bottom. And because it's there at the bottom also, so it can be possible that it's changing the way how the rigid body simulation is working. And so it might be better if we change the shape from mesh to the box. By doing this thing, you will notice that we now have a box around the domino piece. And you don't need to worry about what this box means right now. We'll see it later on. And we have only applied this collision shape change to the first domino piece and not to the others. So I think I should select all of these domino pieces like this with the shift key hold it, then deselect the plane. And at last I'll be selecting this one with the shift key hold it, then go to object menu here. Then in the rigid body, we have this option which is copy from active. This will basically copy the rigid body physics of this active object which was selected at last and will get applied on all the other selected rigid bodies. So now all of them are having the box shape. And now if I just try to play the animation, then this time we notice that most of these domino pieces are animated perfectly, but still we get some issues in some of the pieces. And the reason why it's happening is we use the flipping option in the array modifier, which caused the change in geometry for some of the pieces, like only the objects with this type of geometry, where we have the 3 cutouts on the top and 5 at the bottom. Only these are the ones that are changing their shape. So to fix this thing, the best method can be that you can just undo and try to make the flipping y or the z value to 0. Or else, if you cannot undo it right now, then another method can be that you just select this plane at the bottom. And currently this also having the mesh type in the shape, and it's making the simulation more complex because this part of the plane is completely flat. So it doesn't really need such a complex geometry. So if I just go to the edit mode and select this face, then I can separate this also into a new object. And then we'll use a simpler shape in the collisions. So press P to separate by selection. And with this plane selected, I'll change the shape from mesh to the default convex hull. So I'll select this. And now if I just take the pointer back to frame number 1 and press the space bar, then this time we'll notice a very slight motion or movement in some of the pieces, but it's still very less, so we can ignore that. And as a result, we get a near to perfect result. Now the thing is, we have reached almost 250 frames and we still have the simulation left. So I'll increase the ending value here to 300. But even though I'm doing this thing, and if I try to play the animation, and here you can notice that it does not really play the simulation after 250 frames, even though I have set the ending frame value to 300. Now, the reason why it's happening is by default in Blender, the rigid body simulation is set from frame 1 to 250. And to change that thing, you just have to go to the scene properties here. And then in the rigid body world, you have this cache option where you can set the simulation starting and the ending. So we have 250 frames by default, but I'll change this to 300. And I also think that with this plane selected over here, I'll just select this edge over here and I'll move this in the y-axis to, let's say, over here, just at the edge of this last domino piece so that I can see it falling downwards. That will not be a part of the final animation, but we just see what happens. So I'll keep it like this. And let's also set the origin of this plane back to geometry. And now let's bake the simulation. So let's click on bake, and it will hardly take 1 second to bake the entire simulation. And I can just go to the frame number 1 and press the space bar to play the animation. So we notice that in the ending, this last domino piece begins to fall downwards because there's no plane over here. And all of these are now perfectly complying with the real life physics rules. So basically, this is how you can create any rigid body simulation in Blender. You just have to take care of a few things that we have discussed so far in the first chapter, and this project that we are doing, the main important thing is the type in the rigid body physics. You should know when to choose the active and passive. And another important thing that we discussed previously is how can you make the animations with rigid body simulations, like animating these properties, like dynamic and animated. In fact, we can even use it over here. Like let's say I take the frame back to 1 and let's say I want this ball to go with a much higher speed towards this plane. So what I can do is I can just go to the side view and enable the wireframe display mode. And initially, let's say I place this over here. Then I'll go to the rigid body settings and turn on animated. Let's also insert a keyframe here for the first frame. Then I'll take this to the frame 24 so that we can keep this to 1 second. And here I want it to be like it hits this plane like this. So I'll press I to insert a keyframe here. And I think I should insert a keyframe for the location also at the frame 1. We only added the keyframe for this animated property. So now we have two properties which are animated. The first is the location, which goes from frame 1 to frame 24 like this. And the second property, for which we have only inserted one keyframe right now, is this animated property at the frame number 1. Now somewhere around the frame number 18, I'll insert a keyframe over here one more time, and at the very next keyframe, I'll disable the animated property and insert one more keyframe. And yes, it might be possible that you would see some error, like the UV sphere might skip the animation and reach the plane directly. And that might be happening because of the previous cache or the memory. So you can just go to the scene properties and you can delete all the bakes. Then take the pointer back to frame 1 and press the space bar to play the animation. And this is how we can get a perfect animation like this, where we have a ball or a UV sphere being thrown towards the plane, and then it rolls down and interacts with the domino pieces. And I think we have pretty much everything ready for the simulation. All we need to do now is to make all these domino pieces appear in a curved line that we can change depending on how we need. And to create that, we have to use the array modifier again. And as a result, I'll be selecting all the duplicates here and I'll delete them for now. And let's only keep this first one. Then go to the modifier properties and click on add modifier. Then in generate, let's add the array modifier. Now by default, we get the line shape selected, but you can see that we have other options too, like circle, where you can make this into a circle like this. You can adjust the count value. Then you have the curve option that we'll be using. But since we do not have any curve object selected here, so we can't really see the array. And at last, we have the transform option, which is very similar to the line option, but with a few changes. But the one that we need right now is the curve. And in order to use the curve shape in the array modifier, we have to add a curve object and give it a particular shape that we want. So let's add a Bezier curve in the scene. So press Shift A, then go to curve and select Bezier. Let's go to the top view and let's also go to the edit mode. It's located over here. So I think I should also hide this sphere. Then select the curve, go to the edit mode and let's give it a basic S-like shape. There can be multiple ways to do this thing. First of all, with all these points selected, you can press S to scale this up. You can even select any individual handle and try to rotate it by pressing R. You can even press G to move this anywhere. And not just that, you can even select the individual handles like this and press R to rotate them, press S to scale them down, or G to move them like this. Basically, each point has two handles, the left handle and the right handle, and you can use these to create any type of shape. You can make it more flat or you can make it more steep. So any type of thing can be created with these points in the Bezier curve. And in fact, you can even press A to select all, then right click to subdivide. And this will give us with another point here, which we can use for a much smoother curve. So in this particular case, I think to create an S-like shape, I'll be selecting this point over here, press E to extrude this, press R to rotate it like this, and let's fix the position and rotation of these handles like this. Then I'll select this handle, press G to move this over here, press R to rotate it like this. And let's also subdivide this so that we can get a much smoother curve. Now press A to select all, and I think we should slightly rotate it. And let's also rotate this part, press G to move this. Once everything is ready, we'll go back to the object mode, then select this box over here, which is for the domino pieces. And in the curve object, let's select the Bezier curve. And as soon as you do it, you will notice some domino pieces appearing here, but their orientation or the rotation is not correct. So I'll go to align rotation here. And let's first try to change the X local rotation to 90. And I think it's somewhat perfect. We might have to make some changes, but we don't need to make any changes in the Y axis or in the Z axis. Also, I think that we should set the count value to something like 20, but this also means that I have to scale up the curve even more. It's too small right now, so they're appearing like this. So I'll press S to scale this up, and let's also move it slightly above in the Z axis. So press G and Z, and I'll move them up by 2 like this. Let's also go to the top view to see the size properly. Like I think I can scale them up like this. And other than this, I also think that the rotation is still not proper. Like in the Y axis, I think we can change this to minus 90. And in the count, let's try 30 so that we can get some more of these. And in fact, I think I can keep the count value to 40 instead of 30 so that we can have some even more pieces. Then let's again select the Bezier curve and let's make the final adjustments like the size, the rotation of the curve points. So here I have made a few changes in the things that we have here in the scene. Like I made the shape of the curve something like this. Then I set the number of these domino pieces to 44 in the array modifier. I adjusted this value to 0.5 in these two parameters. And if you want a different kind of result, then you can even adjust the seed value here, which will give you a different type of random result each and every time, depending on these values. And I've set the local rotation as 90 and minus 90 here. And I don't really think there is anything else to see. In fact, we can now apply this modifier, and to convert these into separate objects, let's go to the edit mode, press A to select all, then just like we did before, press P to open the separate menu, and in the separate menu, let's select loose parts. Then press tab to go to the object mode, where we have all these domino pieces which we can select like this. And now with all of these selected, I can select them like this, and with the control key holded, let's deselect the other objects. Then I'll go to the object menu here and set the origin to geometry. Now I think we can test the animation. I have also removed the keyframes that we previously added to the UV sphere in order to make the animation simpler. If needed, we will apply them later on again, but for now we can go with this. Let's press the spacebar to see how the animation is looking. So of course, there are two basic issues that we have to fix. First of all, these objects, which are the domino pieces, are not having any rigid body physics. So the ball will not interact with them. And also, you can see that the placement of this ball is not really correct. Like it's going like this, but we want it to interact with the first domino piece. So it means we'll have to push this slightly in this positive x-axis. And now to fix these two things, I'll first select all the domino pieces here. Let's deselect the curve also. Then go to the physics properties and select the rigid body. Leave the type to active, and we'll even leave the shape and other things to default. Then go to the top view, take the pointer back to the frame number 1, and I'll push this slightly in the x-axis. You might have to adjust it 3 to 4 times, like you test a particular position by playing the animation and see if it's hitting the first domino piece or not, and adjust if anything is required. So for this position, let's play the animation again. So this time we notice that it does interact, but the angle is not correct. So for this thing, I'll be taking this back to the first frame and then go to the top view again. Let's select all these and rotate it like this so that it interacts properly. And also I think I have not yet applied the rigid body physics to other domino pieces. I've only applied it to the first one. So to fix this thing, I'll be selecting all the domino pieces. Let's deselect the objects that we don't need, and with this one selected at last, which has the rigid body physics, I'll go to the object menu here, then rigid body, and select copy from active. Also, I think we can make the UV sphere or the ball slightly bigger in size like this. Now let's again replay the animation. So I'll press the space bar. Now, after making many adjustments in the position and size of the UV sphere, I was finally able to create this animation where it hits the first domino piece and goes like this. And it's going much longer than I expected. So I think to fully complete it, I have to change the ending frame to 600. And even in the rigid body world properties, I'll change the end frame to 600. Then click on bake, and it will take a few seconds to bake the entire simulation. Once the baking is completed, we'll take a look at the final animation from the frame number 1 to the frame number 600. So I think it's looking pretty nice. We have different combinations of these circular cutouts on different domino pieces, and we have this simulation created where the ball first interacts with this domino piece. In fact, I even think you can make this better by adjusting the position of the ball a little more in the x-axis, but still I think that this result is almost close to perfect, like the one you see in the trailer version, and then the animation goes on like this. Now, in this process of understanding the creation of this animation, the main things that we kept in our mind is that how exactly the positions and the sizes of different objects matter. Like if this ball is very small, then also it won't be able to push the domino piece in order to make it fall like this. And if it's very big, then also it will be difficult for it to push the first piece with that much force. So you need to try different sizes and different positions, like I said. And another thing that we learned was keeping an accurate distance between each of these. We controlled this thing by using that array modifier where we had the count value. And before that, when we understood the simple line type, then we use the offset value for this thing. So these are the few things that we have to keep in our mind. And right now, I think we can even render this, but before that, let's first apply some materials to these and set up a proper environment, lighting and everything else. So I think I can select both of these and press A to select all and scale it in the x-axis like this. Let's also push this slightly more in the y-axis. And yes, we'll also be adding a camera in the scene and we'll animate it as well. So to begin with all this, let's first go to the render properties. And in the render engine, I'll change this to cycles. Then in the device, I'll change this to GPU and I'll keep the rest of the settings as same for now. Then go to the render preview mode. And this is our default lighting and the default setup. Now, before we create the materials, I think the first thing should be to fix the lighting because that will decide how the materials should actually look. So for the scene lighting, I'll be adding a sunlight and will adjust its rotation. So press Shift A, then go to light and select sun. And you can see that just by adding a basic sunlight in the scene, we are getting a very nice lighting system where we can see the shadows, this white default material for all these objects. And currently the sunlight is placed over here, basically at the 3D cursor. So what I can do is I can move this up in the Z axis because the position of the sunlight does not affect how it influences the scene. So I can move it anywhere, but its rotation does influence the scene. So I'll be rotating this in the x-axis like this, and then I'll rotate this in the z-axis also like this. So I've kept the rotation in x-axis to 70 and z-axis to 90, or maybe I can try a negative 90 value here. And then I think I can even add one more light, which will be the sunlight again. And for this one also, I'll try to slightly change the x-axis rotation to something around minus 30, and by default, the strength of the light is very high. So I'll go to the object data properties, and from the strength value, you can control the intensity of the light. But currently I am thinking to keep these at the default value of 1 because I'll be making this background plane and the floor have a material which will be dark in color. So we'll then see how much lighting we need for the colors to appear properly. So with this plane selected, which is the floor, let's begin with the materials part. So to add a material to this, I'll change this window from timeline editor to the shader editor. So click here and select the shader editor. Let's create a new material. We'll be using a very basic noise texture to create a nice dark colored material for the floor. So to add the noise texture, press Shift A and select the noise texture here. Then press Shift A to add the color ramp node so that we can control the colors of the noise texture. Now I'll take the factor socket and connect it over here, and then take the color socket and connect it to the base color. By default, we can get a very slight noise texture here, and its colors can be controlled with these pointers in the color ramp node and also this color wheel over here. For now, I'll just remove everything, or maybe I will keep this black pointer to somewhere around here so that I can see the contrast in colors. And I'll keep this to the default black and white only, but in the scale value of noise texture, I'll keep this to something very high, let's say 100. Let's also increase the detailing to maximum 15. Let's also increase the roughness value so that we get an even better texture, but it's still very scaled down. So I think I'll keep the scale value to 200 this time. And to make this look even better, we can even add some 3D effect or some bump effect by using the normal socket. So to add that, let's press Shift A and search for the bump node. Let's place this over here. Take the normal socket and connect it to the normal in the principal BSDF. And for the input, we'll take the color socket and connect it to the height in the bump node. To see the effect properly, you simply have to go to the distance value and begin to increase this. And this will add a 3D effect to the texture that we have on the floor. To observe this thing in a much better way, I can just reduce the scaling to 10, and let's also change the angle in order to see the plane properly. And now let's say I keep this value of distance to around 3 or 4. So this is how you can get a nice 3D effect of the texture. But currently I think I should scale this up, and even the distance value, I think we can go with something higher. Then in the principal BSDF node, I think I can bring down the roughness value to 0.2. And now a very important thing to consider here is that we don't really have to copy these values that I'm adding in the noise texture node or the bump node, because the scaling and the bump effect of the textures also depend on the size of the object that you're having in the scene. If you reduce the size of this floor, then the object scaling will be different, and as a result, you would have to make the adjustments in the texture and the bump node also. So the best way would be to try different values and then try to see what kind of pattern are you getting. And once you get something decent, you can finalize it. In this case, I think we can go with this. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'll be applying the same material to this background plane over here. Basically this curved thing on which the ball will appear. So to apply the same material, click here to open the list of all materials that we have, and I'll select this only material in the scene. Now for the ball, I'll be giving this some red color material because I'm planning to make the domino pieces completely white. The background is somewhat black or dark colored, and so for a better contrast, I'm keeping the color of this ball or the UV sphere as the red color. So let's create a new material for that and change the base color to the red color. I'll be going with the default brightness value, and I think I can give this some slight metallic strength also so that we can see how it reflects the light. In fact, one more thing that we can do is we can hide the overlays by clicking here so that we do not see the outlines and other overlays like the axes and stuff. So you can enable and disable the overlays from here. And now I think we should create another material for the domino pieces. Currently they are having a very flat, simple white material, but to give this an interesting look, we can add some texture to this as well. So let's create a new material for this. Let's add the noise texture node. So I'll add it over here, then take the factor and connect it to the base color. We'll adjust the scale value to 20, and currently it's not really showing much reflections. So I think I can even use the factor socket in noise texture for the roughness parameter. This will make sure that the areas where you have the white color will be having a higher roughness value closer to the value 1, and the areas where you have black or basically the dark texture, there the roughness value will be low, or in mathematical terms it will be close to 0. Let's also increase the detail value to the maximum, and we can even add a color ramp node to adjust the colors. So I'll just press Shift A and search for the color ramp node. Let's place this over here. then I'll first try to adjust the black pointer like this. We can even zoom in to the texture to see it properly. And I think we should reduce the blending of colors here. So I'll take this pointer and bring it close to the black one so that we have very slight spots of these black or the dark color. And majorly the area should be white. So I'll go with something like this. You can try different positions of the pointers or even different colors if you want to change the brightness or if you want to give it some different color. You can do that as well. But here in this case, I think we can go with this. You can even adjust the metallic strength. But again, I think a value of 0 will be fine for this material. And now we have to apply the same material to all the other domino pieces. So I'll go back to the solid mode, then go to the top view so that we can see all the domino pieces. Let's select all the objects here, then deselect the plane, deselect the UV sphere, and let's also deselect the curve at the bottom. And now with all of these domino pieces selected, just make sure that this one is highlighted with the yellow color. And if it's not highlighted with the yellow color, then simply hold down the shift key and left click to select it so that it will be the active object. Then to apply the material of this domino piece to all others, simply press Ctrl L to open the link menu, and from this we'll select link materials. This will apply the same material to all of these domino pieces, and this is exactly the kind of result that we wanted to achieve. And now to make this look even better, I can just go to the render properties, and first of all I'll turn on the denoisy option so that we can get rid of that noise. And then I'll scroll down, and here we have color management where I can change its look. Like by default, we have the base contrast, but we can increase the contrast, which can make it look more alive. Like a high contrast will look like this. Similarly, you have other options also like very high contrast, which will further increase the contrast of the scene and the colors. So you can adjust this option to anything that you want. Here in this case, I think we can go with the high contrast. Now, currently, I think that the lighting is not perfect. Like we need to increase the intensity of the lights. So I'll select the sunlight here, then go to the object data properties. And for this first one, I'll keep the strength to something around 2 or 2.5. And then for the second sunlight, I'll very slightly increase this to around 1.1 or 1.2. And this will make sure that we have an adequate lighting in the scene, like you can see here. You can even take a look at different domino pieces in the scene and how they're looking. You can adjust the scale value of the noise texture or make the changes in the color ramp node. Like here, I think I should slightly reduce this pattern, basically the scaling value, and I can even push this white pointer closer to the black one like this. And this is now looking much better than before. Now in the trailer version that I rendered, you can see that this ball is having these lines or this pattern. And to create this thing in this version, I'll select the ball. Let's also change this to the timeline editor, and I'll take this back to the frame number 1. And we'll make some changes in the edit mode of this UV sphere. So what I'll do is I'll go to the front view and let's deselect everything. Then press 2 for the edge selection mode. Select this edge loop over here, and let's go to the top view now and select this edge loop. Let's select these two also so that we have basically 4 quarters as we can see in the top view. And then what I'll do is I'll use the bevel tool by pressing Ctrl B, then press Alt E to extrude the faces along normals and push them in like this. Then return back to the object mode and we'll get a ball like this. And it actually looks like that Xbox logo. But now returning back to the scene, we have the ball ready, we have the lighting, the floor, the background plane, and even the domino pieces completely ready. The only thing that's left now is to add the camera in the scene so that we can record the animation from different angles. And we'll be keeping it very simple. Like we'll take the shot first from here. Then as the ball moves forward to this region, we'll add the camera over here. And then in the ending, we'll place the camera over here so that it can record the scene. So here, let's begin with adding a camera in the scene. For that, press Shift A, then select the camera. And by default, it will get added over here at the position of 3D cursor. So I'll just go to the object properties here and reset the rotation in all the 3 axes to 0. Then I'll zoom into the camera and I think I should rotate it in the x-axis by -90. And I'll also move it up in the z-axis like this. Or maybe for the front view, I should rotate it like this by 180 so that we can see the front. Let's go to the camera view by pressing 0 on the numpad. And now I can use the lock camera to view here to make any changes in the camera view like this. So for the first shot, I think I can keep the camera to somewhere over here like this in such a way that we can see all the dominoes in the frame falling down. So let's also play the animation to see that till which frame we want this particular camera view, and then we'll switch to the other one. So I think that till this frame we can have this particular camera view. Then we'll switch to the other one that we'll see from here. So to fix this position of the camera, I'll take the pointer to frame 195, press I to insert a keyframe with this camera selected. And then for the very next frame, I'll change the camera view to something like this. Then press I again. This will help us to change the camera view like this. At the frame 196, we'll see the animation from, let's say, this particular frame. I'll press I again to update the keyframe, and let's press the spacebar again to play the animation ahead. So I think that we can keep this to, let's say, around frame 410. So I'll insert a keyframe by pressing I for this camera, and on the very next frame, I'll change the camera view one more time so that we can see this from this angle over here like this. You can adjust the camera view. Just make sure that you have this lock icon enabled, which is to enable the view navigation in the camera view. So here I think I can press I to insert the last keyframe. And then if I press the spacebar again, then we can see the animation from this particular camera view. And with this, I think that we have everything ready in the scene. We don't have to make any other changes. We have this entire animation. Like if you want, you can make some final adjustments in the materials or the way this animation is looking, or maybe in the environment. Like if you want it to be darker, then you can go to the world properties and reduce the brightness of this color to make it completely black if you want. But I'll go with the default one in this case. And now you even know how to switch different camera views like this. So with this, we now arrive to the end of the first chapter. The main purpose of creating this project was to understand the very basics of rigid body physics, which are also the most important thing to understand. Because if you know these fundamentals, then it becomes very easy to do the testing with the other properties and understand what they do. And yes, in most of the things that need rigid body physics, even this much knowledge about the fundamentals and the basics will be enough, and you'll be able to create a good number of rigid body simulation examples. But of course, in the coming two chapters of this course, you will see some more concepts related to the rigid body physics, some more examples. So we'll see each other in the chapter number 2 now. Welcome to the chapter number 2, Advanced Rigid Bodies. Now that we have understood the basics in the first chapter, we are now going deeper into the settings that actually control the behavior of the simulation. This is because rigid bodies are not just on or off. The quality of your result depends on many different things like collision shape, friction, bounciness, deactivation, and constraints. These settings decide whether your simulation looks stable and realistic or not. So in this chapter, we will understand what these controls do, and then we'll use all our knowledge from both the first chapter as well as the second chapter to create this project of the Newton's cradle. One of the most important settings in the rigid body physics is collision shape. The collision shape is not always the exact visible mesh. It is the simplified shape that Blender uses for physics calculations. Primitive shapes like box, sphere, capsule, cylinder, and cone are usually faster and more stable. But shapes based on mesh, like convex hull and mesh, can match the object more closely, but they can be slower and less stable depending on the object. So the rule is simple. Use the simplest collision shape that gives you the result that you need. Now let's understand this thing practically with examples inside Blender. So first of all, press A to select all and X to delete. And I'll be adding a UV sphere in the scene because it will be easy to understand the concept of collision shape with that object. So press Shift A to add a UV sphere. Let's move it up in the Z axis and right click to apply Shade Auto Smooth. Then I also need a plane which will act like the floor on which the UV sphere will collide. So press Shift A and go to Mesh and add a plane. Let's scale it up, let's say 10 times. And then I'll go to the physics properties and let's set the rigid body type to passive. Then for the UV sphere, I'll set the rigid body type to active, which is the default. And right now in the collisions shape, you can see that we have convex hull selected by default. It is used for some slightly complex mesh with not too much detailing, like it does take the shape of the mesh. And so if I just play the animation, then we see a very simple, a basic animation where the ball simply falls down and interact with the plane. And just like before, if I just rotate this in the x-axis slightly, let's say by 3 degrees, and then if I replay the animation, then the UV sphere will continue its motion and will rotate as well. And currently we are not seeing any problem because it is acting just like a ball or a sphere. But let's say I go to the collision shape and change this to a box. On doing this thing, you will notice that we can see a box appearing around the UV sphere. Now what's really happening here is that Blender does know that this is a UV sphere with this particular mesh, but for the calculation of physics in rigid body, it will consider it as a simple box object. And so the interaction of this mesh or the ball with this plane will be exactly the same as if a box would fall on the plane. So to understand this thing, let's take the pointer back to frame 1 and replay the animation. Here you can see that we have the animation as if the box fell downwards. There is no rolling of the UV sphere. It just simply interacts with the plane. Then we notice a little bit bounce, but it's not falling down because of the incline, unlike the UV sphere. So this is how the collision shape works in Blender. You just have to see that what is the closest shape to which the mesh resembles. Like you have multiple options here. If you're using a cube object, then you can go with a box. If you're going for something spherical, like we had in this case, you can go for a sphere. Then if you have a shape like a capsule, you can go with capsule. Similarly, you can go with cylinder, cone, and then for some slightly complex mesh, you can go with convex hull, which is enabled by default. Like it wraps around the mesh to create the boundaries around the object on which the rigid body physics will apply. And if you have a very detailed mesh, or in case you see the objects showing some incorrect rigid body physics, then we can go with this mesh type in the shape. Now, one more thing to consider here is that the size of this box is not random. Like if I take the pointer back to frame 1 and then go to the front view, you can see that Blender basically creates this box in such a way that it has the minimum volume and it completely covers the sphere. You can confirm this thing from the side view and the top view also. It's like it touches the boundary so that it can have the minimum area or the volume. And it's also true for other shapes like cylinder. It will form a cylinder around it and its size will depend on the size of the UV sphere. So this is a very simple concept where you just have to notice the shape of the object and decide the collision shape. Now, friction controls how much resistance an object or basically its surface has when it moves against another surface. Low friction means the object slides more easily, and high friction means the object grips more and loses the motion faster. Coming to bounciness, it controls how much an object rebounds after collision. At low values, the object feels dead or basically heavy, but at higher values, it becomes more elastic and bouncy. These two settings are small, but they completely change the personality of the simulation. Now, under sensitivity in rigid body physics, we find the setting of collision margin. And collision margin is the small distance around the surface of an object where Blender still considers collisions. This can help improve stability and performance, but if the margin is too visible, it might look that the objects are not directly contacting with each other or like they're floating slightly above each other. So you have to take care that its value is not too high or too less. And when do you have to use this? Basically, if your objects seem to collide before they visually touch, then only you have to check and adjust the value of collision margin. Now coming to deactivation, it is another useful option available in Blender for rigid bodies. You can find it under the dynamics section where it is turned off by default. And let's understand what it actually does. So when a rigid body comes to rest, Blender can stop actively simulating it until something wakes it up again. This is useful in scenes with many objects because Blender does not need to keep calculating objects that are already sleeping. But just like many other physics settings, it can sometimes create unexpected behavior. So in short, if your object is still showing the behavior of a rigid body, even after it's fallen down and you expect the simulation to end, then you can use the deactivation setting to turn off the rigid body simulation for that specific object after a few interactions with the other rigid bodies. In a similar way, you also have this setting called start deactivated, And you can see that when a rigid body simulation starts, then if any two objects have some space between them, then they will begin to fall down until they are at their rest position. But if you want to stop this thing from happening, and maybe you want some external object to hit them, and only then you should start the simulation. So for that, you have start deactivated. If you turn this on, then the rigid body will be deactivated at the start of the simulation, and it will stay like that unless an external rigid body interacts with it, and then the rigid body simulation gets activated. So these were a few advanced settings that are not really used too much in Blender. Like most of the times you will use the settings that we learned in the first chapter, but only if you want some special kind of results, or if you're getting some errors, then you have to make the changes in the properties that we have covered till now. Now let us see how we can use these advanced settings and even some other settings to create this Newton's Cradle animation. So to begin with, here I have a new Blender file opened, and by default we get these three objects which we don't need. So I'll press A to select all and X to delete. And to create the Newton's Cradle, the first and the most important thing is the ball, and for that we'll be adding a UV sphere. So press Shift A, then go to Mesh and select the UV sphere. Let's right click and apply Shade Auto Smooth. Now most of the motion in this entire animation will be performed by the UV sphere. The rest of the things are mostly for support, like we'll have to create the support frame, the suspension wires or the strings that will be attached to the UV sphere or the pendulum balls. Then we'll have the connectors and stuff. But overall, if we talk about the rigid body simulation, then that thing will be done by the pendulum ball or the UV sphere. Now to give this some basic rigid body simulation, let's go to the physics properties and add the rigid body physics because it has to interact with the other pendulum balls. So we have to do this thing. And currently, if you take a look at the rigid body settings, there's one setting that we have not yet discussed. It is the mass setting. By default, it is set to 1 kilogram. And for most of the things that you do with the rigid body physics in Blender, they can work with the default setting. The reason why this happens is that in Blender, you do not have any wind or any air by default. Like you do have the option to add it. Like you can press Shift A and then in the force field, you have all these different options, especially the wind that can be affected by the mass setting here. But otherwise, if we take a look at the Blender scene that we get by default, we do not have any wind acting or any air resistance. And you must be knowing this thing that in case of vacuum, an object's mass does not matter for how fast it falls. Like in absence of air, two balls of different mass value will fall at exact same speed. And same is the case in Blender. Unless and until you're having wind in the scene or you're making two different objects interact such that there will be motion between them, there's no need to change this setting. But in this particular case, let's say I want this ball to be heavy because it is going to interact with the other balls in the scene. So I can keep this mass to something very high, like 100 kgs. And now the way it will interact with the other balls that we'll just add will be different if the mass was at the default value. So right now to get the other pendulum balls, let's go to the modify properties and add the array modifier. Now I want them in the y-axis. So in the offset x, I'll change this to 0. And in the offset y, I'll change this to 1. Then in the count value, let's set this to 5. And other than this, in the rigid body physics, we have the collision shape, which I'll change to the sphere. In fact, we can even go to surface response. And by default, we have friction set to 0.5. But you must be knowing that pendulum balls are smooth and they don't really require such a high friction value. Like if you want, you can test the results and then decide it. But I think I'll keep it to something low, like 0.1. And I also want some bounciness in the balls so that when they interact, they can show motion in a much better way. So I'll keep the bounciness value to something high, like 0.8 or 0.9. Just make sure one thing that you do not set the value to absolute numbers like 0 and 1 because it might cause some errors. So I'm keeping this to 0.1 and 0.9 respectively. Now, if I have to separate these UV spheres into different objects, then I first have to apply the array modifier here, and then we can use the separate method by loose parts to separate these into different objects. So you can just click here and select apply, then press tab to enter the edit mode. Make sure that all of the vertices are selected. You can ensure that by pressing A to select all, then select B to open the separate menu and select separate by loose parts. Now if I go to the object mode, then we have all these as different objects. Now the issue is that the origin point of all of these UV spheres is located over here. Like you can see this yellow colored tiny dot which is representing the origin point. So the origin points of all the UV spheres is at the position of the origin point of the first UV sphere. So we need to set them at the center of geometry. So I'll select this, then right click and go to set origin and select origin to geometry. You can even go to this object menu here and set origin. I'll now select this one, then set the origin to geometry. And let's do the same process for this last one also. Now we have the rigid body physics on all the 5 UV spheres and their origin point is also at the correct position. But right now, if you think about the scene for a second, these are just simple 5 balls that are placed in the world space, and so naturally we would expect them to fall down. In fact, if I press the spacebar to play the animation, then they fall down like this. But since we want to use them as pendulum balls for the Newton's cradle, we want them to behave as if they're hanging from a particular point. We don't really want this type of effect from rigid body physics, which makes them fall down. Instead, we want them to interact with each other, show the motion, and for that, we have to tell Blender that it has to apply a constraint for this UV sphere to basically make a point above from where this ball is hanging. It will act as an invisible thread or a string which is holding this UV sphere, and so it will not fall down. And to create such a thing in Blender, we have to use the rigid body constraint. You can see that in the physics properties, just below the rigid body, we have the rigid body constraint. So to use it, I first have to bring an object in the scene that I'll take to that particular point from where I want the ball to be hanging, and then we'll apply the rigid body constraint to it and set this object as the target. So for this, you can add any object that you like. It can be a cube, a plane, or maybe even an empty object, like you have this empty category here, and you can add any object from here if you don't want it to be visible in the scene. In this case, I'll keep the thing simple. So I'll go to mesh and select the plane here. Let's go to the front or the side view and push this up in the z-axis by, let's say, 8 meters. So it will be placed over here. And now I want that the origin point of this plane should be that particular point from where the ball is hanging. Now, to make this thing happen, I'll simply go to the physics properties and then add the rigid body constraint. Since I want it to act like a point, so in the type, I'll change this to point. And in the first object, you have to select the UV sphere, which I want to basically control. But yes, one thing that I forgot is before using the rigid body constraint, we also need to apply this rigid body to this plane. So I'll add the rigid body and move it above the rigid body constraint like this, and then set the type to passive because I want this to be a stationary object and it should not show any motion like falling down. So I'll keep this to passive. Now returning back to the rigid body constraint, for the first object, you have to select the target, which is the UV sphere. And for the second object, you have to select the where we have this point from where it is holding the UV sphere. And now we have to repeat this process for other balls also. But before that, I want to make sure that you're not confused about anything here. Like first of all, the reason for doing all this is we have to tell Blender that we don't really want this ball to be falling down, but instead it should be hanging from a particular point. Now for that point, we can add any object that we like. In this case, I added a simple plane and then its origin point is acting as that particular point that we needed. Then to first tell Blender that this is controlling the UV sphere, we have to use the rigid body physics and the rigid body constraint, where this rigid body physics is placed above the rigid body constraint. So this will control the ball like that. And we set the passive type in the rigid body physics because we do not want it to move down or act like an active rigid body in the scene. Then in the rigid body constraint, we selected the type as the point. And in the object setting here, in the first type, you have to select the target, which is the sphere. And in the second type, we selected the plane. Now we have to repeat this process for all the other UV spheres. So we have to create 5 duplicates of this plane. So you can either duplicate these, like we can just go to the top view, then press Shift D to create a duplicate. I'll move it in the Y axis by 2 meters. And then to repeat the same step again, you can use the shortcut which is to press Shift R. This will repeat the last thing that you did, like the last step, which was to duplicate and move the plane by 2 meters. So it will do that thing for you. And now with this plane selected, we have to fix its objects in the rigid body constraint. I'll remove the first object here, which was the first UV sphere, and I'll be selecting this one over here. Similarly, for this plane, I'll be changing this to this sphere.002. Then for this one, let's select the sphere.003. And finally, for this one, I'll be selecting the last sphere, which is the sphere.004. And yes, another method to create the duplicates can be to use the array modifier like we used for the UV spheres. Like you can set the count to 5, then apply the modifier and separate it by loose parts. But in that case, just make sure to set the origin back to geometry. You can simply right click and set origin to geometry for all of these planes. But in this case, we already have the origin point here, so we don't need to make any changes. Now let's say I want to rotate the UV sphere in such a way that it considers this point as the pivot point. Currently, if I try to rotate this UV sphere, it's normally rotating around its origin point, and this is the same thing with all the others also. But just like we did for the physics part, if I want it to rotate from here, then I will have to add my 3D cursor at this point, and then we have to change the transform pivot point to the 3D cursor. Right now it is set to median point by default, which means that it's taking the median point of the selected objects and considering that as the pivot point. But let's say I just change this to 3D cursor, and if I select this UV sphere, which has its origin point here, but the 3D cursor is here, then we should expect that it should rotate around the 3D cursor. So if I press R, then you can see it's rotating like this. This means that if I change the position of this 3D cursor to this object here, basically to the middle point of the plane, it will take that as the pivot point and we'll be able to rotate the ball. So with this plane selected over here, I want to set the 3D cursor at this origin point. So for this, simply hold down Shift S and you will get this option called cursor to selected. If I leave, then it will get applied here and you can see that we now have 3D cursor located here. What we basically did was selection to cursor, which as the name suggests, it places the 3D cursor at the origin point of the selected object. So now if I select the UV sphere and let's say I try to rotate this by pressing R, then you can see that it's taking that 3D cursor point as the pivot point. But yes, just make sure that you have the 3D cursor selected here and not any other option. So we have a lot of things done here. We are able to rotate this properly in the x-axis like this from this point. We have all the rigid body physics and the constraints applied too. And so now I think we can do a short test of whether the rigid body physics is working properly or not. Like let's say I just rotate this in the x-axis by maybe minus 45 degrees like this, and just make sure that the timeline pointer is at the frame number 1. Then if I press the space bar, then we get a perfect animation of the Newton's cradle. And yes, one very important thing to note here is that we only added the 3D cursor at this point for this UV sphere. But if I ask you that how does this UV sphere know that it has to take this point as the pivot point, then the answer to that will be we have the rigid body constraint added to the plane with this particular UV sphere selected as the target. And so the sphere is taking the origin point of the plane as basically the pivot point, which is holding it from above for the rigid body physics. But for the manual animation part, we had to manually add the 3D cursor here so that we could rotate it around that point. And now moving ahead, the next thing that we'll do will be to add the strings that will hold the balls. And for that, we'll be using some cylindrical objects. So let's go to the front or the side view. And I'll also take the pointer back to the frame 1. Here, I also think that I should reset its rotation and position so that I can add the strings at the rest position. So I'll press Alt G to reset the location and Alt R to reset the rotation. Then again, I'll go to the front view, then press Shift A to add a cylinder. Let's go to the edit mode and scale this down like this. And then I'll scale this up in the z-axis. Let's push it down in the z-axis over here. And then I'll press R to rotate it like this. And then I'll push it slightly in the x-axis over here. Here I think I can scale it down further, but currently it's scaling around the 3D cursor. So I'll change this back to median point and again scale this down like this. By pressing Shift Z after S, I can lock the scaling to only X and Y axis like this. And let me also rotate it slightly. Let's push it in the x-axis to place this over here. After this, let's add the mirror modifier to get the string on the opposite side also. So let's go to the modifier properties, click on add modifier. Then in generate, we have the mirror modifier. By default, it has the x-axis. If the objects in your scene have different rotations or they are placed differently, then you can choose that particular axis. And currently the origin point is located over here by default. which is the position of 3D cursor. So we won't change that for now. If needed later, we'll change the origin point position, but for now, I think it's fine. So we'll go with this. Other than this, I think we can go to the top view and create its duplicates. So I'll press Shift T to create a duplicate, then move it in the Y axis by 2 meters just like before, and use the shortcut Shift R to repeat the last step. So I'll press Shift R 3 times so that I can get all these strings. And I also think that instead of keeping this space empty, I can add a tiny sphere to cover this part, just where we have the two strings interacting with the ball. So I'll press Shift A, then go to Mesh and add the UV sphere. Let's go to the edit mode and scale this down. Then I'll push this downwards over here. Let's scale up, and you can adjust the scaling in this way that both the strings are covered properly. And then let's shade auto smooth, and this is how it looks. Now, just like we duplicated the balls and the strings, we'll repeat the same procedure for this also. So let's go to the top view and press Shift D to create a duplicate in the Y axis by 2 units or 2 meters. Then repeat the same step by pressing Shift R 3 times for the remaining 3 spheres. Now let's take a look at the scene. So we have the balls, the string, and even this UV sphere for connecting both the parts. And currently, if I try to make any changes in the rotation of ball or I try to move it, then these objects are not showing the same motion. So the solution for this is that you can parent these objects to the UV sphere. So for this, I'll first select the strings, then with the Shift key hold it, select the UV sphere, and at last, select the parent object, or basically that object whose location and rotation you want to be copied and applied to the other selected objects. So it is the UV sphere in this case, and therefore I have selected the UV sphere at last. And you can even check this thing that it is highlighted with the yellow color, which means that it is the active object since it is selected in the end. So now to parent, simply press Ctrl P to open the parent menu and select Set Parent to Object. Now, if I select the ball and try to rotate it anywhere, you can see that the string and the UV sphere are rotating along with it. Now again, if you want, you can change the pivot point back to 3D cursor so that the rotation will happen around that point. Like if I press RX, then this is how the rotation will happen. Now similarly, let's apply the parenting to the other parts of the model. Like for the second ball, I'll be selecting the strings and the UV sphere and then select the ball at last. Press Ctrl P to apply parenting to the object. Let's do the same process for this third one. Ctrl P to apply parenting to the object. Then repeat the same here also. And at last, I'll be selecting this one and just make sure to select the UV sphere at last. Then press Ctrl P and set the parent to object. Now the main objects in the scene that had the actual rigid body physics, or basically the parenting settings, are perfectly set up in the scene. The next thing will be to model the bars on which the strings and the pendulum balls will be resting. We'll also be hiding these plane objects which we used for the rigid body constraint, and we'll also add a plane at the bottom and also something for the background. Then I'll show you the lighting system that I used in the trailer version of the file. So to start with all that, let's first select these 5 plane objects in the scene. With the Shift key hold it, I'll select the 5 of them and press H to hide them. Also currently, they are only hidden from the viewport version, but when you try to render it later, they will still be visible in the scene. So what you can do is you can go to this scene collection, and here you have these 5 plane objects that we have just hidden. You can see these icons. We have disabled it in the viewport, but to make sure that they do not appear in the final render, you have to disable this camera icon. So we'll disable all of these, and now they won't even appear in the render version. Now to create a bottom plane, we'll be adding a plane in the scene. So press Shift A, go to Mesh and add a plane. It's appearing over here at the position of 3D cursor. So let's scale this up, let's say 10 times, or maybe I should scale it up 1.5 times more and then push this down over here. Let's go to the front or the side view so that we can push it down. I won't be touching the plane and the balls together because these balls are actually hanging from the strings and they're not really lying on the plane. So we don't really have to make any contact between them. Then I'll move this in the Y axis so that we can keep this over here. Then go to the edit mode, press A to select all, then give it some slight thickness by extruding it down like this and return back to the object mode. We now have a nice floor. So now we can even add those bars. And for that, I'll be using the cylinder objects and then we'll connect them together on the top. So to add a cylinder here, press Shift A, then go to mesh and select the cylinder. Let's go to the front view over here and I'll place this somewhere over here. Then go to the edit mode. Let's scale this down and I think I should now change the 3D cursor to median point, which is also the default option. Let's scale this down and scale it up in the Z-axis to make it longer like this. And I will scale it up slightly further, then push it down in the Z-axis like this. Now while being in the edit mode, I'll create a duplicate of this and move this in the Y-axis over here. And now to connect them together, I'll be creating one more duplicate of the cylinder while still being in the edit mode so that I can connect them together later on. So press Shift D to create one more duplicate, then place this, let's say over here, press R to rotate it by 90. You can type 90 using numpad after pressing R to rotate it by 90 degrees. Then I'll push it above in the Z axis and let's scale it up in the Y axis like this. Now to connect these two together into a single continuous mesh, we'll use a tool called the Bridge Edge Loops. To use it, I'll first enable the X-ray mode, then select these vertices over here. Then with the Shift key hold it, select these as well. Press Ctrl E to open the Edge menu and select the Bridge Edge Loops. This will connect both of them together, but currently it's completely flat because this area is lacking some geometry. So to make this rounded or curved, you can go to this menu over here on the bottom left corner and you can increase the number of cuts, which will add the geometry and make it look like this. Now in a similar way, let's go for the other side, then select this, hold down the Shift key and select this, press Ctrl E and select this option again. Then in the number of cuts, let's enter 4 and we now have this bar on which the strings and the balls will be hanging. So I think I should move this down over here in the Z axis. Also, let's go to this view and move it in the X axis over here like this. Let's disable the X-ray mode and I'll shade smooth like this. Now to get the same thing on the opposite side, I think we can simply duplicate this and move it in the X axis over here. And now we have everything completely ready. So I'll again change the pivot point back to 3D cursor, then select this ball over here, press R, then X to rotate this in the X axis by let's say -60. And if you now press the spacebar, then this is how the animation will look. If you think there are any adjustments needed anywhere, like the position of the bars or the strings or anything else, you can fix that. But currently I think that everything looks perfect here and we can move forward with this. So now we have to do the next thing, which is to add some materials. But before that, let's change the render engine and also switch to the render preview mode. So you can click here to change this to the render preview mode. And then for the render engine, by default, EV is selected, but I'll change this to cycles and change the device to GPU. Now we are not able to see anything clearly right now because we have the scene lights and the scene world enabled, but currently we do not have any specific scene lights added or any HDRI added. So we are seeing the darkness in the scene. So for now, in order to get some light, just to get a preview of how the scene is looking with the cycles render engine, I'll turn off the scene lights and the scene world, and this will add a temporary HDRI in the scene, which won't be visible in the final render, but we can use it right now to see the things and how the materials will look. So we'll create the materials, apply the shaders now, and then I'll also show you the lighting setup that I used in the final trailer version. So the first material that we'll create will be a black color material for this bottom plane. So for this, let's go to the material properties and create a new material. For the color, I'll give it some dark color, like maybe gray or black. I'll keep the metallic value to 0, but to make it smooth and more reflecting, I'll keep the roughness value to 0.2. It will also help us to get some nice reflections of the lights when we add them. So I think this will look nice. The next material will be the one that we'll use for the bars and the strings. We'll use something that looks like steel material. So for this, let's go to the material properties and I'll keep the base color as white, but for the metallic strength, let's increase this to the maximum. You can even keep this value to 0.9 if you are seeing any errors. And for the roughness, I think we can bring it down to something like 0.2 and it looks like this. So you can make any adjustments that you want, either in the metallic strength or in roughness or any other property. Like you can even play around with the anisotropy value, or maybe you can change the base color also to something else. But currently I'll go with a very simple material. And now to apply the same material on the other bar and also the strings, I'll first select all of them by holding the shift key. So let's select all the strings And then at last, I'll be selecting this bar on which we have the material.001 already applied. Just make sure that it's highlighted in the yellow color, meaning that it is the active object. Then press Ctrl L. This will open the link menu from where I select link materials. This will apply the same material of the active object to all the other objects in the scene which were selected. And now all we have to do is to create some material for this tiny UV sphere and these balls. So what I'll do is with this selected, I'll go to the material properties and I'll reduce the brightness of the base color and make it something like the gray color. Then in the metallic, I think I'll keep this to the maximum, and in roughness, I'll keep this to something like 0.1 or 0.2 so that it looks a little dark. And then after that, we'll use the same technique of linking the materials. So let's select these 4 UV spheres by holding the shift key, and then at last select the one with the material, press Ctrl L and select link materials. Now finally for the balls, I'll first select this one. Let's create a new material. And for the color, I am planning to keep this to something like the orange color, but I think I should slightly reduce the saturation. And then in the metallic strength, I'll increase this to 1 and I'll set the roughness to 0.2. This will give it a nice shiny look that I need for these balls. And I'm planning to keep the opposite balls of the same material. So on the other end, we have this ball. So let's apply the same material to this. And now with this selected, let's create a new material. And for this one, I'll keep this to something like blue or purple. And of course, you can select any color that you want. It's not like you have to select the exact same colors. Just make sure that the colors that you are choosing go well with the background and lighting and also with the other materials in the scene. Now let's apply the same material on this ball also. And then for the middle one, I think we can go with the red color. So in the base color, let's change this to red. Then in the metallic strength, I'll keep this to 1 and roughness to 0.2. Now this is how the scene is looking. We have a base, the rods, which are holding the strings and the balls. And now if I go to the viewport shading menu here and enable the scene lights and the scene world, then you can see that in reality, this is how our scene is looking. So now I'll show you what exact lighting setup I used in the version that I used in the introduction. So this is the file having the complete lighting setup in the scene. And before I explain you how the lighting is set up, one important thing to tell you, which is that you can download this project file and all the other project files that I used in this course from this website, and you can find the link of this website in the description. And now returning back to the topic, let's enable the overlays so that we can see the lighting setup. First of all, for the basic lights, we have this orange color light over here. I have used a point light and it has a very high power, and you can see that it's giving us these reflections in the floor that we have used here. So if I move it like this, you can see that we are able to see the reflections and also the shadow of the ball that is in front of it. Other than this, on this right hand side, I have this blue color light, which again is having a very high power value. And this one is also a point light. Apart from this, if you go to the world properties here, by default, the gray color is selected here, which gives you the gray color viewport. But in this case, I have used a different node system in the shader editors. So I'll show you how I created this setup in the viewport where even though I'm not using any HDRI in the scene, but I'm still able to get this white colored light from the front and this black light from the background. So to show that to you, I'll change this window to the shader editor and just make sure that you have the shader type selected as world. By default, you will see that all these nodes won't be present in your layout. Like if I just remove this from here, then this is the default layout with maybe the gray color set over here, something like this. But we can actually make changes in the background by using the nodes that are available in Blender. Like I use the gradient texture node to create a gradient where on the front side we have the white color and on the back side we'll have the black color so that we can create a contrast and there won't be too much lighting in the scene from behind, because for that we have the lighting that you can see. And I also added this plane at the back so that we can get some reflections from behind. Then I use the texture coordinate and the mapping nodes to control the angle. Like if I connect this back to get this texture, then you can see that rotation value in the y-axis is 60 degrees, but by default it was 0. So I was getting this kind of result. And you can see that if I go to the camera view and try to change this value to 60 again, it's appearing as if the light is coming from somewhere on the top rather than front. Similarly, if I change this value to 120, let's say, then it will appear from the back side somewhere over here. But if I change this to 90, then it will appear as if the light is coming straight from the top. So I tried different values here, and 60 degrees value was working perfectly fine. So I finalized this. And other than this, I don't really think we have anything else in the lighting setup. I kept the strength value to 1.44. If you want, you can adjust any of these values to get a different kind of result. Or if you want, you can even change the texture type from gradient texture to something else like the noise texture, Warner texture. You will get different kinds of results with each of the textures. And yes, without this plane at the back, I was not really getting the results that I wanted. Like if I hide this and go to the camera view now, you can see that this is the kind of result that we are getting. It's looking very dark, and there's also no light coming from behind. So by adding the plane, I was able to get some reflections and also a nice background. And so this is all in the second chapter. In this one, we try to understand some more concepts related to rigid body physics, and we also created this Newton's cradle as an example, where we even touched upon the concepts of rigid body constraints and other tools. Welcome to the chapter number 3, Self Fracture and Destruction. Now we are going to take rigid bodies into one of the most exciting areas of Blender physics. Instead of simply simulating a single solid object, we will learn to fracture an object into many pieces and then use the rigid body physics to make those pieces react, fall, collide, and break apart. For this, we'll be using Blender's Self Fracture add-on. We'll learn about how to install it and use it in this chapter. So coming to Self Fracture, it comes added in the Blender software as a separate add-on which we just have to enable from the preferences. And once it is enabled, we can select any object and use the Self Fracture to break it into many pieces. So the Self Fracture allows us to break a mesh into smaller fragments, and once those fragments have rigid body physics, we can use it to create the destruction effects. Now let's see how we can enable the Self Fracture add-on. So you simply have to go to Edit, then you have Preferences. Let's open this. Now in add-ons, simply search for the Self Fracture add-on, and by default it will be disabled like this. You simply have to click here to enable it. Then we can confirm it in the get extensions that we have the Self Fracture added. Now let's close this window, and to confirm it here, let's say with this cube selected, I go to Object, then in the Quick Effects, here we see this option of Self Fracture, which means that it is now properly installed. In fact, I think we can even take an example to understand it's working properly. So let's delete all of this and then press Shift A, go to Mesh, and let's add the monkey or the Suzanne object. Let's move it up, let's say over here. And the reason of choosing this object is that it has a slightly more complex geometry. So we'll be able to see the effect of self fracture in a much better way. Now with this selected, if I go to object, then quick effects and select the self fracture, then we'll see this menu over here, which has so many different options that you can use to control how the object will be broken down into pieces. Like you can control the point source, the source limit, which is basically the number of input points. Like if you reduce this, you will get lesser number of pieces later on. Then you can control the noise, the scaling. The only thing that you might have to change sometimes is the source limit value. But even for this, I think we can go with 100 for now, which is the default value, and click on OK. Here you can see that the object is now broken into several different pieces, and we still have the original Suzanne object. Let's hide it for now. And you can also notice that it's not completely perfect. Like we do notice some extra objects which are not proper, which was simply because of the complex shape that we have. But yes, it does help to get an idea of how the Self Fracture add-on works, what it does. You can even notice that we now have several objects in the scene. You can check it in the scene collection here, and because we set the source limit to 100, so we have a total of 100 objects. Like we have this numbering from 1 to 99, and we have this cell object also. You can even check this thing on any other object. Let's say I choose a cube object, and then with this selected, I go to object. Then in quick effects, you will go to self fracture, and this time, let's say I change the source limit to 25. And this time, because we have reduced the number of source limit, and also because the geometry is very simple, so you can see that we get much simpler result this time. We simply have this cube broken down into these pieces over here. And basically, this is the entire concept of self fracture. But instead of trying it on different objects, a much better way would be to use this add-on practically in the final project that we are going to start, which is the brick wall destruction scene. Here we'll cover everything that we learned so far. like the rigid body settings, using the cell fracture along with rigid bodies, animating everything, and creating the entire scene. So here I'll delete all these objects by pressing A and X to delete. And now the first thing that we have to do is to create the brick wall. And in order to do that, we first have to create a single brick piece, and then we'll duplicate it using the array modifier so that we can create the entire wall. And for that, we can start by adding a cube object in the scene, and then we'll change its scale and apply some modifiers to give it some details. So press Shift A, then go to Mesh and select the cube. Now let's go to the edit mode. And first of all, let's scale this down. Then I'll scale it up in the y-axis, then scale it down in the x-axis. And yes, there is no right or wrong way to create a brick. It's just that the scaling will decide that exactly what kind of brick are you making. If it's very thin, the way it shows the rigid body physics will be different. So I'll keep it to something like this, where we have a nice shape of a brick which is neither too thin nor too much wide. So we can go with this. Now to give it some details, we'll add the bevel modifier and subdivision. In fact, we can just work with bevel for now, and we'll use the subdivision for those brick objects that will have the effect of cell fracture. So currently let's go to the modifier properties and let's add the bevel modifier. Then in the number of segments, I think we can go with 3, and let's reduce the amount because I don't want it to be too much curved. We just want a little bit bevel like this. Let's right click to apply shade or to smooth. And I think that it is looking perfect for the brick. Now to create multiple copies of this brick, let's use the array modifier. So go to the modifier properties again and add the array modifier. Then in the offset X, I'll change this to 0, and I'll keep the offset Y value to -1. If you want to add some little gap between these, then you can change this value to -1.005 so that we can have a very slight gap in between. And I'll keep the count value to, let's say, 8. So we can have 8 bricks over here. And now to get more on the top also, I'll again go to the modifier properties and click on add modifier to add the array modifier. Let's scroll down. And in this one also, I'll enter the value 8, but I want these to appear in the z-axis vertically. So I'll change the offset x to 0 again and the offset C value to 1. Now currently they're looking very uniform and not very realistic. So I can go to randomize option and I can add some randomization in the X or the Y axis. In this case, I think the Y axis will be useful for us. You can even try to change the rotation in any of the axis if you want. But again, I think that this is not required. I'll only be keeping the offset Y value in the randomize to 0.25, and I'll go with the default settings for the rest of this. Now the next thing will be to apply all these modifiers so that we can create a material for it. We won't simply create one material for the brick and apply it to all the objects. Instead, we'll try to create a common texture on all these that actually looks consistent and real rather than simply having the same material on all the bricks. So for this thing, we first have to apply the bevel modifier, this array modifier here, and this last array modifier. And now if you go to the edit mode, you can see that we can now select all the vertices of all these bricks. So they're combined into a single object with a proper mesh. We will separate them into different objects later on, but for now, we have to apply a common texture to all of this. And for this thing, let's first go to the render preview mode, or I think maybe we can add one more window here in the 3D viewport so that on the one side we can see the 3D viewport or the shader editor, and on the other side we can see the render preview mode. So for this thing, you can just take your cursor over here, then you will see your cursor changing into this. Then if you left click and drag like this, you can split the window. And after this, I'll change this to render preview mode. Then in the render properties, change the render engine to cycles. And in the device, change this to GPU. Also, we need to get some light. So for now, let's disable the scene lights and the scene world. And I think currently I can change this to shader editor so that we can work with the material nodes properly. Now let's create a new material. By default, it is completely white colored, but to make it look like a nice brick texture, we have to use some nodes for the texturing and the coloring part. So first of all, coming to the basics, we'll be using the noise texture along with the color ramp node so that we can give it some orange color, and we'll connect that to the base color. Then after that, we'll make some changes in the roughness also using that same noise texture node and a map range node. And then in the end, we'll focus on normal, where we'll be adding a bump node to get some nice 3D effect. So to start with this, let's first add the noise texture here. let's place this over here. And for the colors, let's add the color ramp node also. So I'll be adding this over here. Now I'll take the factor socket and connect it to factor in the color ramp. And for the color output, let's connect it to the base color. You will begin to see a black and white noise texture pattern. For the scale value, we can go with either 5 or we can increase it very slightly. Like I think 6 will look nice. And instead of having the black and white colors, I'll take this first pointer over here and I'll keep its color to something like brown color. I don't want it to look completely black. So I click here to change the color. Then this color wheel will appear from where I'll change this to something like this. Then for the second pointer, let's bring it closer so that we can control the blending of colors. And after that, I'll change this to the orange color. I have slightly reduced the saturation, and this is the combination that I'm going for. This is a very basic version of the colors. And to make it look even better, let's play around with roughness and the normal socket with the bump node. So for the roughness part, I'll be adding the map range node to control it. So I'll press Shift A, then search for the map range node. Let's place this over here. For the input, we'll take the same noise texture. So I'll take the factor and connect it to the input value. Then for the output, I'll connect the result socket to roughness. And now if I try to change the value of 2 min and 2 max, you can see that we are able to control the reflections. In this case, I think we can go with something like 0.55, and in the 2 maximum value also, we can keep it to something around 0.75. Like it's giving us a nice consistent look of roughness, but it's still not completely same throughout the entire area. If you want, you can even go with the default roughness value, or maybe making some normal changes, like you can keep the roughness value to 0.6 or 0.7, but using the map range node will allow you to control it in a much better way. So it's totally up to you if you want to add it or not. It will also take the noise texture into consideration, which is basically this pattern over here that you can see. And now in the end, the most important thing is the bump node that will connect to the normal. So for that, let's add the bump node over here. I'll place this here and connect the normal to normal in the principal BSDF. Now the bump node will need something for the input. So I'll take this noise texture node and create a duplicate. And for the bump node, I need to make some changes in the scale. Like I want it to be more scaled up. Like I can keep this value to something very high, but in order to see the difference here, I also have to change the strength value and the distance. Like here, I think I can keep this to 0.3 and the strength value to somewhere around 0.45. Then I can control the scaling, and you can see that we are able to see the difference also. We are getting a nice 3D look on the bricks. And the best part is that all this is happening with such a simple geometry. Like all we have is the bevel modifier added, and we are still able to get these details like you can see here simply because of the bump node. Now here in the detail, I'll increase this to 4. You can go even higher if you want. It will give you an even better result like you can see here. But I think that a value of 4 is also looking nice. So I'll go with this. In the roughness also, I think I can increase this to 0.6 for much better results. And I don't really think we need to make any other changes. So we can go with this. Now moving ahead, we can make this look even better by adding some gray color stuff, which is also called mortar, in between the bricks. And for that, we can go to the edit mode, then press 3 for the face select mode, then select this face over here. Then I'll go to select menu here. Then in the select similar, select area. This will select all the faces having the same area as this one. Then with the shift key hold it, I'll select these two also. Then again go to select and select similar area. And now you can see that we have almost all the faces selected except for the corner edges over here. So I'll press Ctrl I to select all of the corner edges, which is basically for inverting the selection. So we are able to select all the edges here, which are at the corners. And then if I go to the material properties and create a new material, then click on assign, then you can see we have the new material added to these faces. Now it's currently white colored, but we'll change it to something that looks like the gray colored mortar. So first of all, if you want to keep it very simple, you can directly go to base color and reduce the brightness, and you'll get somewhat decent results. You can adjust the roughness value, maybe add a little bit of bump effect. But in this case, I'll be showing you something more advanced. So if you understand some advanced concepts of shader nodes, like working with multiple textures at a time, using the mix node, then in that case, you can continue with this. Otherwise, you can go with the basic gray color material. So for that texture, I'll be adding a basic noise texture node first for the base color, and we'll be using the color ramp node to control the colors. So press Shift A then search for the noise texture. Let's place this over here, and in between here, I'll be adding the color ramp node to control the colors. Let's place this over here. Now I'll keep the scale value to either the default or something slightly higher like 15. I can notice very slight difference if I actually pay attention to the details. Or else if you want to notice the difference, you can take the pointers and move them like this. And then if you change the scale value, you can see what difference they are making. Now for the first pointer, I'll change this to the gray color. And for the second pointer, I'll keep this one also as gray color, but a slightly lighter shade. Now, just like before for the roughness, let's add the map range. I'll place this over here and take the factor and connect it here. And for the output, connect the result socket to roughness. Now in the to minimum value, I think I need to zoom in to see the results properly. I'll keep the to minimum to something like 0.8 and the to maximum to around 0.95. Also, if you're not much familiar with these nodes, try to change the values here and try to observe that what kind of changes you see in the final version. With practice, you will come to know that, okay, this kind of value will give you this type of results, and how you can effectively experiment with some specific values so that it won't really waste a lot of your time. Like here in this case, I think we can go with this, but even right now, it's not really looking very much realistic. So I can fix this thing by working with the bump node. So let's add the bump node here, then connect it to the normal here. And for the input, we'll be using a mix of noise texture and the Warner texture node. If you want, you can even go with the same noise texture node or another noise texture node with a different value of scaling. But I personally experimented with different textures to see what kind of results I'm getting for this gray part. And I found a combination of the noise texture and Warner texture, which was actually looking nice in the trailer version. So I'm going for that. So I'll be selecting this noise texture node and duplicate this. Then let's also add the Warner texture here. I'll place this at the bottom. And to put both of these together into the bump node, we have to add the mix node. So press Shift A, then search for mix. And I'll select this first one. Now take this factor here and connect it to A, and take this distance socket and connect it to B. Then I'll take the result socket and connect it to the height so that we can see the actual results here. Let's also increase the value of distance, and I'll bring down the strength value to 0.25, and let's keep the distance value to 0.4. But in the scaling, I think I can increase this to something around 100. Let's also try to increase the detail. Also, if you want, you can go to the render properties and enable denoise, but you might notice some lack of detail, and the materials will also look too much polished, which you might not want. So it's completely up to you if you want to turn this on or not. Also, you can use this factor value in the mix socket if you want to change the influence from noise texture to Warner texture or the opposite. Like the middle value basically represents a 50% mix of both the noise texture and the Warner texture. But if you keep this value to anything lower than 0.5, then the texture that we get will have more effect of the noise texture, which is connected to A. And if you keep this value to anything above 0.5, then you will see more effect of the second texture, which is the Warner texture. Also, you can change the scaling in Warner texture if you want. You might notice some very small change in the texture. So again, it's completely optional. And I don't think I should be making any other changes here. So I'll go with this. And so we now have the materials properly applied. And you can even see that the wall is really looking very nice right now. Of course, we still have to make the lighting changes, set up the entire lighting system basically, which will affect how the final version will look. But currently, I think we can go with this. And now let's say I move forward and separate all these bricks into different pieces. Now you might expect that this texture will remain as it is, but let's see what really happens. So if I go to the edit mode, press A to select all, press P to open the separate menu and select separate by loose parts. Then here we notice that each of these is now a separate brick, but because of separating this, the texture is now incorrect. We are getting a repeated texture across all the tiles, which does not really look very nice, and it does not feel like a single wall. And to fix this thing, we simply have to undo first of all, so that we can get back to the previous version where we had a single object for the entire wall. Now let's go to the edit mode, press A to select all, then go to the UV settings here, and here you have an option of cube projection. So I'll select this. This setting will bake each vertex position on the wall into a permanent UV map. Now to tell Blender that it has to use that UV map, we have to input the UV map in the texture. So just make sure that you have the orange texture of the brick selected. Then to use the UV as input, we have to use the texture coordinate node. So press Shift A and select the texture coordinate, and then I'll place this over here. Here you have the UV socket as the input. So if I take this and connect it to vector, and let's do the same thing over here also for the noise texture. Then after this, if I now go to the edit mode, press A to select all and P to separate by loose parts, then this time we are no longer getting the repeated pattern across the tiles of the wall. So this is looking completely perfect for the wall. We can even select individual tiles now. Now moving ahead, we'll add a plane at the bottom, and then we'll create the chains, set up the rigid body physics, and also use the cell fracture add-on to create the disruption effect on the walls. So first of all, to add the floor at the bottom, press Shift A, then go to mesh and select the plane. By default, it is placed over here. So let's move it down in the Z axis, and I'll scale it up, let's say 20 times. Let's change the angle to see how it looks. And I think I should scale it up further like this and return back to the object mode again. Now it's looking very bright right now because of the white color of the floor. So let's give it some materials. In the base color, I'll change this to the gray color. Then for some metallic value, I'll keep this to something like 1 or 0.9. Then to get better reflections, I'll change the roughness value to 0.2. And now I think it looks perfect. So we can go with this. And now let's move ahead and create the chains and the ball which will interact with the bricks. So for this thing, the base object that we'll use to create the chains will be a torus object. To see how it looks, let's press Shift A, go to Mesh and select the torus. Then after this, let's go to the top view. And I think that we should keep the focus only on the torus object right now. So I'll use the / key and then go to the top view, press 7 on the numpad, and this is the geometry of a torus object. To make the chain from this, I'll turn on the X-ray mode and I'll select this half of the vertices and basically delete this. Or maybe I think I should undo and deselect these vertices over here so that only the bottom half gets deleted. Then press A to select all, G and Y to move this slightly above, let's say over here. And now I want the same thing to appear on the opposite side also. So go to modifiers and let's add the mirror modifier here, change the axis to Y axis and turn on the clipping option. Then I'll select this edge loop over here, press E to extrude this in the Y axis like this and left click. Let's repeat the same procedure over here also. And this will give us this object that we can use for the chain. Let's right click to apply shade auto smooth. And let's also apply the mirror modifier. Also, I think I can apply shade smooth directly. And now let's again click the / key to take this out of the focus. Now we'll adjust its scaling and other things, but first let's go to the front view and place this over here. Then go to the edit mode, press A to select all and rotate this in the x-axis by 90 degrees. And now let's scale this down by pressing S. Now I think it's very thin right now and it might cause some issues with the rigid body physics. So to fix this thing, let's go to the edit mode, press A to select all and use the shortcut Alt S, which is basically for shrink and flatten, and left click to finalize this. Now, after adjusting the sizing and other things, we'll begin with creating its duplicate so that we can hang the ball with that. So to start with that, let's go to the side view, press Shift D to create a duplicate, and I'll place this over here. Then rotate this in the Z axis by 90 degrees, and it's changed the angle to see how it looks. So I think it's looking perfectly fine. You just have to ensure that don't intersect with each other while you're modeling them, because later on when we apply the rigid body physics, then due to the force of the ball at the bottom, they will move down and interact with each other perfectly. So we don't have to do it manually right now. Now I'll select both of these, press 3 to go to the side view, then press Shift D again to create the duplicate and place this over here. Now let's change the view again, and I think we can repeat the same procedure again by pressing Shift R. Then I'll select all of these and move these slightly up, let's say over here, so that we can get a nice height for the ball. We don't want it to be hanging so low that it touches the ground. So I'll keep it to something like this. In fact, if you want, you can even select these two, press Shift A to create one more duplicate like this, and you can keep it like this. Now for the ball, let's add a UV sphere and place it over here, just below this chain object. So press Shift A, go to Mesh and add the UV sphere. Then go to the front view, press G to move it over here. Let's go to the side view to adjust its position in the Y axis also and place this here. Now let's increase its size. like this, and I'll move it slightly down over here. Also, I think I can very slightly increase the size again. So now I think it's looking perfect. Now to see how the physics will actually function with the chains and the ball, I'll be selecting this first object on the top, then go to the physics properties here. And for this one, we'll be using the rigid body type set to passive, because this is the object that will hold the entire chain and the UV sphere. And in fact, this will also be the position of the pivot point, because we have to rotate the ball like this, and then it will go and hit the wall. So this one will act as a passive object. And for all the other objects, we'll be using the active rigid body type. So let's select all these objects still here. In fact, I can even select this one and the ball. So I'll select both of these as well, then go to rigid body and keep the type to active. But currently it will only get applied to the last selected object. Like you can select these and you won't have the rigid body physics. So we have to copy the rigid body from the active object. So go to object menu here. Then in the rigid body settings, you have the option to copy from active. Now this means if I press the space bar, we are seeing the physics, but it's not correct right now, which can be because of many different things. Like first of all, the main thing is we are using the convex hull in the collision shape. And as I explained you before, it can cause some errors when it's interacting with other rigid bodies. So the best way is to use mesh here. In fact, what I'll do is I'll select both of these and join them together into a single object. And in the shape, I'll change this to mesh. Now let's select the other ones also. I'll select all these objects except the one on the top. And then in the end, select this last one. Then to copy from active, go to object, then select rigid body. And here you will find copy from active. Now I'll select this one and let's change the shape of this one also to mesh from convex hull. And now if we try to play the animation, then this is no longer falling apart. Of course, we have to make the things better to make sure that it does not make some weird animation like this. So a few steps have to be taken care. First of all, you have to ensure that the origin point of all of these is at the middle only. And then what you can do is you can select all of these by holding the shift key, then go to the edit mode, press A to select all, and Alt S to change the scaling, or basically the thickness of these objects. Now if I try to play the animation, then this is how it's appearing. We have the chains looking perfect, but the ball is not really completely perfect right now. So let's take the pointer back to frame 1 and go to the edit mode. Then with my cursor over here, if I press L, then this will select only the chain part and not the sphere. Then I'll press Alt S to shrink this as well. Then after this, I'll change the mass of this one to 10 kgs so that we can have some more weight over here, and it will make sure that the gravity acts on it so that it remains in this position only as much as possible. So let's play the animation. So this time it remains in this position. So I think we can go with this. Now let's say I want that it should rotate in such a way that the ball along with the chain is angled like this and then it hits the wall. So for this thing, we first have to take our 3D cursor at this position over here where we have the origin point. So with this selected, hold down Shift S and go for cursor to selected. Then I'll select all these objects here, change the pivot point from default median point to 3D cursor. Now with these objects selected, if I press R to rotate them like this and then press the space bar, so this time the animation is working properly. You can see that we don't have any errors and the ball is swinging perfectly with the chain. But still, if you want to make it even better, what you can do is you can increase the number of these objects in the chain. Like you can duplicate to create more. Just make sure to go to the original frame, which is the frame number 1, while doing this step, and also make sure that none of the chain objects are intersecting with each other. And one last thing to take into consideration is the top object over here should always be the passive object in the rigid bodies, and the rest of them should be the active objects. Now moving ahead, the next thing that we'll do is to create some destruction effect on these bricks that we have on the wall. And for that, we'll be using the cell fracture add-on. So first we have to select the bricks on which we have the impact of the destruction. Like I think we can select some bricks over here. Let's deselect the plane at the bottom, and you can deselect some random bricks on the sides. Just make sure that when the ball hits this area, we have at least those bricks selected where it's interacting with the wall. and then we'll show this effect of breaking on some other bricks surrounding it. So with these bricks selected, I think we can use the cell fracture add-on to break these down. So first of all, I'll take them into a new collection, and for that, the shortcut is to press M to move to a new collection, then click here, and let's name this collection 1 only. Now, if I go to the scene collection, you can see we have this collection 1 with all these cube objects. After this, the next thing to do will be to first add a basic rigid body physics to these brick objects. So I'll be selecting all these brick objects here. Let's deselect the plane at the bottom. And with these selected, I'll go to the physics properties. And the reason why I'm seeing passive here is that this is the active object which is selected here. You can see it has a yellow origin point. So what I can do is I can hold the shift key and select this as the active object. And now I'll go to the rigid body physics. And by default, we'll use the passive type. We'll use the active type only for those bricks which will actually interact with the ball and show the destruction effect. And similarly for this plane also, I'll be selecting the passive rigid body type. Now, currently the rigid body physics is applied only to this brick and not the others. So I'll select all of them again, then deselect the plane, select this one at last, then go to object, rigid body, and select copy from active. Also, all of these bricks are not having their origin point at the correct position. Like for each of the brick, you have the origin point over here. So to fix this thing, let's again select all of them, then go to object, set origin to geometry. Now after this, if I press the spacebar to play the animation, then you just saw that the ball hits the wall, but the bricks do not move because it's a passive rigid body and it won't actively participate in the rigid body simulation because currently all the bricks are having the passive rigid body type. So to make the bricks interact with the ball and basically fall down, show the destruction, we have to go to the collection one that we created and select all the objects. Like I've selected the first one here, and then with the shift key holded, I'll select the last one. And for all of them, I'll change the type to active, then go to object, and in the rigid body, change this to copy from active. Now I'll take the pointer back to frame 1 and press the spacebar again to play the animation. This time we notice a nice animation of the rigid body physics where the bricks will fall down, but we don't just want them to fall down simply, we want them to break and show destruction. So for that we have to use the cell fracture add-on. But before I do that, I'll go to the dynamic settings and turn on deactivation, and in this turn on start deactivated. This will ensure that those small particles that will be created because of cell fracture do not show any movement or any rigid body simulation before they are hit by the ball. We learned about this concept of deactivation in the second chapter of this course, so you can refer to that chapter if you want. For now, we can move forward and add the cell fracture add-on to these bricks. So go to object, then in the quick effects, select the cell fracture. Then this menu will appear where you can change any settings that you want. Here, in this case, for the source limit, I'll set this to 25 and click on OK. Now, before we test the simulation, let's first move all of these into a new collection so that if we want to make any changes, we don't have to select each of these individually. So press M, new collection, and I'll name this one cell fracture. So let's type cell fracture here and press enter to confirm. Then I think we should apply some rigid body physics to all these. So I've selected one of the objects here and then go to rigid body. Then in the type, I'll keep this to active and turn on deactivation just like before. Then go to object, then rigid body and select copy from active. Also, another thing that I would like to do is I'll hide all those objects in the first collection that we created where we had the bricks because now we have the smaller pieces of the bricks because of the cell fracture. So I have hidden the objects in the collection 1. And here in this case, if you want, you can even increase the source limit that we used in the cell fracture settings. And you can even try to change the mass value if you think that the mass of this ball that will interact with it is too little to push them. So you can check these things, but actually they will depend largely on how the animation is actually looking. So I think we should play the animation to check how it's going. So press the space bar to play the animation here. And this is how the animation is looking. We have the ball interacting properly with the broken pieces of the brick, and the overall simulation is also coming along pretty well. So I think we can work with this. But yes, it might be possible that you would see some errors, like maybe the fractured objects are exploding or they're not moving at all. So in that case, you can try a few things like making sure that the deactivation settings are turned on, the mass value is correct, you have the active rigid body type selected, the origin point is on the correct position, because this thing is exactly the same as what we tried with the bricks earlier. The only difference is that the bricks are now broken down into smaller pieces, so there shouldn't really be any issue in this. And now all we have to do is to add some lighting in the scene. First of all, for the lighting, you can go to the world properties and make sure that the strength is down to 0, so that when I go to the render preview mode and with the scene lights and the scene world enabled over here, which were disabled previously, and so the result look like this. But with the scene lights and scene world enabled, our scene should look completely dark, but I think I have some light in the scene already, so I have these two sunlights that I'll hide for now, and this is the kind of result that you should be seeing by default. Basically, we have reduced the strength of the environment light down to 0. Then I added this first sunlight here. You can see that it's placed over here, and to see it properly, I'll move it up in the z-axis, and there will not be any difference in the lighting because the position of the sunlight does not really affect the lighting at all. And I've rotated it slightly in the x-axis. You can see that in the object properties, I have some rotation values here. Then you can add one more sunlight in the scene, and this time I have placed it like this. You can notice that they are both in opposite directions. One of them is pointing in this direction and one of them in this direction. And because of that, I'm able to get a very nice lighting setup in the scene. If you think that this is complicated, you can just forget about this and simply add any sunlight. Just rotate it in the x-axis, rotate it in the y-axis slightly till you get a nice lighting. Then go to the object data properties and increase the strength value here, and you'll get a lighting like this. You can adjust the rotation in z-axis to check what kind of result you need, and the results will be really good. Now moving ahead, let's create some material for this chain and the ball. So first of all, I'll select the ball here, and to give it some material, I think I should first play the animation so that I can see how the light will interact with the ball and also the chain. So I think that this position is perfect. Now I'll go to the material properties to create a new material. First of all, I'll increase the metallic value to somewhere around 0.85, or maybe let's further increase this to somewhere around 0.87. Then in the roughness, I'll bring this down to 0.25 or around 0.27, and I'll go with the default settings for the remaining options. Now to give it some look of rusting iron, I can use some noise texture with the color ramp node. So let's add the noise texture node here, and for the colors, let's add the color ramp node here. Let's place it over here, then connect the factor to the factor in color ramp, and then take the color output and connect it to the base color. For the first pointer, let's change this color from black to something like the brown color so that it can look like actual rust. And I'll keep the second pointer to white color only. Now in the scale value of noise texture, you can adjust it depending on how much rust you want on the object. And to make it look better, I can go to detail and increase it to maximum 15. You can even play around with the roughness value. Like if you increase it, you will see that the colors will blend in much less. But if you bring it down, then you will see that it's looking a lot blurred as compared to before. So I think I can keep this to the default value for this case. And now it looks perfectly ready. The next thing to do will be to select all these objects in the chain, then select this one at last, press Ctrl L to link the materials. And with this, our scene is now completely ready. Now to make sure that the animation plays smoothly in the viewport, you can go to the scene properties here, and in the rigid body world, I'll keep the simulation start to 1 and ending to 120, and then bake the simulation. Now after taking some time to finish the baking, if I now try to play the animation, then you can see that we are able to play it very smoothly like this in the 3D viewport. I can simply scrub through the timeline and see the results real time. And if you want to render this into a complete animation, you can maybe add a camera at, let's say, this particular angle over here, and then render the complete scene. And finally, This brings us to the end of the Blender Rigid Body Masterclass. We started from the very basics, what rigid body simulation is, how active and passive objects work, and how to animate and make simulations. Then we moved into the advanced settings like collision shapes, friction, bounciness, deactivation, constraints, etc. And finally, we used all that along with the cell fracture to create the destruction effect and build a complete brick wall destruction project. So now after all this, you do understand how to control the simulation, what to do if you get any errors, and how to use it creatively. If you enjoyed watching this course, then do like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and keep experimenting in Blender. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in some other one.